Betrayal in relationships is not a legal crime, but it is a conscious act that harms someone who has trusted you deeply. This betrayal can lead to significant emotional pain and can sometimes escalate into situations that involve actual crimes. The story of Kathy Chou was unusual from the start. Investigators first thought she might have run away from her strict parents, been kidnapped by one of her many online followers, or taken an impulsive trip with someone without informing anyone. There were even rumors suggesting that her parents could be involved in her disappearance. Sadly, Kathy was never seen alive again. For over a year, the investigation went nowhere until unexpected clues emerged from an unlikely source. Shockingly, the culprit had been hiding in plain sight the entire time and even managed to pass a lie detector test. Kathy's parents came from a small province in Taiwan. In 1989, they moved to the United States in search of a better life and settled in Renton, Washington, which is close to Seattle. At that time, they spoke very little English, which made it hard for them to adjust to their new surroundings. They led a private and isolated life, seldom interacting with neighbors or the local community. On November 29, 1990, they had their only child, a daughter named Kathy Chou. Unlike her parents, who found it challenging to connect with others, Kathy was a cheerful, outgoing, and lively young woman. She had a natural ability to make friends, but her upbringing was strict, influenced by her parents' cultural values and traditions. Kathy was not allowed to invite friends over and had to report where she was, with whom at all times. As she got older, the restrictive environment at home became more challenging for her. Even though Kathy followed her parents' rules, she often felt constrained and isolated. In high school, she set up multiple profiles on social media, where she openly shared information about herself, her interests, her experiences. These platforms allowed her to connect with others and escape some of her parents' limitations. She even developed a modest following online, which helped her deal with the lack of freedom in her everyday life. As Kathy started dating and expressing interest in boys, her father's disapproval became more intense. Her father criticized every young man she interacted with, as he strongly disapproved of the relaxed and independent lifestyles of American teenagers. He was convinced that his daughter should marry someone from Taiwan rather than a local man. He frequently shared his growing disappointment with life in America with his wife, expressing regrets about immigrating and often mentioning his wish to return to their homeland. In the fall of 2009, 18-year-old Kathy Chou was in her senior year of high school when she started dating Ezekiel James Watkins, who was 2.5 years older than her. They had known each other since their teenage years. As Ezekiel also attended Renton High School, their relationship lasted only a couple of months, and during that time, Ezekiel never visited Kathy's home. Instead, they met in neutral locations or spent time at Ezekiel's apartment, which he shared with a friend. This was because Kathy's father, Mr. Chou, strongly disapproved of Ezekiel due to his unconventional appearance and bold behavior. Ezekiel was a musician and a popular figure, known for frequently changing girlfriends. Kathy was thrilled when he showed interest in her and was so determined to continue seeing him that she sometimes lied to her father and defied her parents' wishes to sneak out for dates with Ezekiel. After the new year, Kathy's relationship with Ezekiel ended just as quickly as it had begun. Ezekiel lost interest in her and soon started dating other young women, one of whom was Kathy's classmates. This situation deeply hurt Kathy, whether it was intentional or not. She had truly loved Ezekiel. He was her first serious boyfriend. Their relationship felt special and full of promise. Kathy was determined to win him back. Initially, those close to Kathy and Ezekiel believed they had separated amicably and remained friends. Kathy soon began dating other young men, probably to demonstrate to herself, others, and especially Ezekiel, that she was still attractive. Unfortunately, this unconventional method, combined with her frantic efforts to rekindle her relationship with Ezekiel, ultimately resulted in a tragedy. On April 19, 2010, Kathy's parents reported their daughter missing to the local police. The night before, Kathy had gone out with friends, taking only her phone, and failed to come home. Her parents expected her back by 8:30 p.m., but when she didn't return, her father called her. Kathy ignored her father's calls, which only added to their worries. At 9:30 p.m., they received a message from Kathy. She said she was having coffee with a friend at Westfield South Center Mall and would be home a bit late. Although this made her father frustrated, he and her mother waited patiently for her return. However, when midnight passed and Kathy still hadn't come home and her phone was turned off, her parents became increasingly worried. They started calling Kathy's friends, but none of them had seen her that night. Concerned, her parents decided to go to the shopping mall themselves. By the time they arrived, Westfield South Center Mall was closed, except for the movie theater and a few cafes, but there was no sign of Kathy. The tension in the Chou household was rising, but her parents still hoped their daughter, Kathy, had just stayed out too late and would come home soon. By morning, when they hadn't heard from her, they decided to go to the police station to report her missing. Kathy's absence from school that day worried her teachers and classmates, as she was a responsible student who never skipped classes without a good reason. This led her parents to suspect that she might have lied to them and gone on a date. The big question was, who was she with? This was something the police would need to investigate. The investigators approached her disappearance with great urgency right from the start. They quickly began searching for her, interviewing her friends and acquaintances to gather any potential leads. Unfortunately, their initial efforts didn't yield any useful information. Detectives contacted Kathy's cell phone provider and found that her phone last connected to a network at 9:30 p.m. from a local park next to a large, marshy area. This discovery raised serious concerns. Kathy had not been at the mall as she had said. Instead, she had been in the park where she sent her last message to her father before turning off her phone, which has remained off since then. Detectives decided to start their investigation by interviewing Kathy's ex-boyfriend, Ezekiel Watkins. When he was brought in for questioning, he appeared noticeably anxious and genuinely concerned about Kathy's disappearance. Ezekiel explained that he and Kathy had broken up around 3 months ago, but had continued to be friends. He mentioned that they had both moved on and were dating other people, so there were no hard feelings between them. He also suggested that Kathy might have been dating multiple people simultaneously, although he admitted he didn't know the names of any of her new romantic interests. When asked about his activities on the night his ex-girlfriend, Kathy Chou, went missing, Ezekiel stated that he was at home with his roommate, John Carpenter. They lived together and spent the evening playing video games until about 3 a.m., after which they went to sleep. John, neighbor, who was also acquainted with Kathy from school, confirmed Ezekiel's alibi and was willing to assist the police with their investigation. Ezekiel acknowledged that Kathy had sent him a message earlier in the evening, asking to meet. However, he turned her down, claiming he was busy because he wasn't interested in going out. He revealed that Kathy frequently tried to reach out to him, and he believed she wanted to talk about their past relationship. To avoid that conversation, he chose to make an excuse. Ezekiel's story initially appeared credible, but investigators were hesitant to rule him out as a suspect. His alibi was only supported by his roommate, prompting detectives to request that Ezekiel take a polygraph test. After some hesitation, he consented. The test results generally supported his version of events, though a few of his answers were somewhat ambiguous. Investigators considered these discrepancies to be minor and within the normal margin of error. In the end, they concluded that Ezekiel was unlikely to be connected to Kathy's disappearance and allowed him to leave after the questioning. However, questions remained about what Kathy's parents might be concealing. Kathy's friends noted that she was very active on social media and dating websites, where she often met new people. Recently, she had been on dates with several young men, yet no one seemed to know who these individuals were. Investigators believed that many answers to their questions could be found on Kathy's laptop, which included her accounts and private messages. However, they faced a major obstacle when Kathy's parents refused to allow them to enter the house. search her room, or take any of her personal items. This behavior raised suspicions among the investigators, who felt the parents might be hiding something. The police attempted to explain to Mr. and Mrs. Chou that Kathy's laptop could hold important clues, possibly even the identity of someone who could have harmed her or been involved in her disappearance. To find this information, specialists needed access to her online accounts. Despite this, her parents were uncooperative. They insisted on taking the laptop to a programmer they knew, claiming they would first review the contents themselves before handing everything over to the police. On April 21st, investigators called Kathy's parents in for questioning and recommended that they take a polygraph test. Kathy's mother immediately became upset and said she couldn't go through with it. Kathy's father, though hesitant, agreed to the test but appeared very anxious. During the test, he had intense emotional responses, often crying as he answered questions. Ultimately, he did not pass the polygraph, which heightened the suspicions about her parents. Detectives were eager to find the truth, so they interviewed the neighbors of the Chous, and their insights were interesting. The neighbors reported that Chou had moved into the house in 1989 after immigrating to the United States, but over the 20 years since, they had not formed any close relationships. The Chou family was known for being reclusive. They rarely socialized, never invited anyone to their home, avoided visiting others. Even Kathy's friends had never been allowed inside. The Chous were not considered rude. They simply preferred to maintain their privacy. They were very protective of Kathy's reputation and were cautious about her friends and social activities. This concern, investigators believed, explained their reluctance to hand over the laptop. They wanted to understand what their daughter had been involved in first. The reason they failed the polygraph test was quite straightforward. She had been missing for 3 days, so her parents were extremely emotional, filled with worry, fear, and grief. The investigator realized that their mental and emotional state would likely affect their ability to pass the test. A few days later, Kathy's father came back to the police station on his own with Kathy's laptop. This time, he agreed to take another polygraph test, and the results indicated that he was telling the truth, clearing him of any involvement in his daughter's disappearance. Kathy's parents were worried about her admirers, fearing that her laptop might contain private photos or videos that could damage her reputation. They wanted to keep everything private. Fortunately, nothing concerning was found. However, investigators learned that Kathy had been chatting online with 8 different young men and had gone on at least a couple of dates with each of them. Kathy enjoyed the attention from these young men and often bragged about it to her friends, leading some to speculate that she might have been trying to make Ezekiel jealous. Regardless of her reasons, the police had to investigate all of these young men for any connection to Kathy's disappearance. Thanks to her message history, the police were able to gather their names, phone numbers, and the dates and locations of Kathy's meetings with them. In the following days, detectives successfully located all 8 individuals and brought them in for questioning. The youngest was 17 and the oldest was 24. Kathy had met each of them online, and they did not know one another prior to this. She had reached out to them and arranged the meetings, but it was evident that she had not formed a serious relationship with any of them. However, investigators were considering whether one of them might have developed intense feelings for Kathy, potentially leading to possessiveness or jealousy. 5 of the young men provided strong, confirmed alibis for the night Kathy went missing. 2 were out of town. 1 was working an overnight shift. Another was in the hospital recovering from a car accident, and 1 spent the entire night at a bar with friends, which was verified by security camera footage. The last 3, who lacked solid alibis, voluntarily took polygraph tests and were cleared of any suspicion regarding Kathy's disappearance, leading the investigation to a standstill. For several weeks, search teams thoroughly explored the marshy area behind the park where Kathy's phone signal was last detected. Despite their extensive efforts, they found no evidence of her. Investigators also struggled to find witnesses who might have seen Kathy in the park that evening. Flyers featuring Kathy's photo were distributed across the city, and social media groups were created where friends and acquaintances exchanged information, theories about her disappearance. News outlets covered the case, urging anyone with relevant information to come forward. The police received hundreds of tips from people claiming to have seen Kathy the night she disappeared or later in various parts of the city. Unfortunately, every lead turned out to be a false alarm, as these sightings involved different young women who resembled her, often of Asian descent. The investigation quickly hit a dead end, with no new evidence, leads, or witnesses to pursue, and progress came to a standstill. By this time, most people believed that Kathy was no longer alive. However, the questions about what happened to her and who was responsible still existed. There was a lingering fear that a dangerous individual remained at large, posing a potential threat to others. In the summer of 2011, police received a call from Giovanni Candelario, who claimed to have crucial information about Kathy's disappearance. Giovanni was a friend of John Carpenter, the roommate of Ezekiel Watkins. He had been temporarily living in their apartment since April of the previous year due to a fight with his girlfriend, but he had not been mentioned in the investigation and had never been questioned by the police. Giovanni stated that he knew Kathy through mutual friends, although they were not very close. He informed the police that on the night Kathy disappeared, April 18, 2010, Ezekiel did not come home at 8 p.m., as he had previously said. Instead, Giovanni remembered Ezekiel arriving closer to midnight and asked to borrow a shovel to bury a duck. At that time, Giovanni was playing a video game but noticed that Ezekiel was covered in mud. When Giovanni inquired about it, Ezekiel explained that he had been riding his bike off-road, fell into a puddle, and got dirty. Shortly after this, Ezekiel asked John Carpenter to go outside with him. Giovanni wasn't sure how long they were gone because he had fallen asleep. When detectives questioned Giovanni about why he hadn't come forward earlier, he explained that he hadn't considered the detail important at the time. Since Ezekiel was quickly cleared as a suspect, Giovanni also was never prompted to give a statement. Candelario said he did not suspect anything at the time. However, in the following months, he noticed a significant change in Watkins's demeanor and began to question the incident. Initially, investigators doubted Giovanni's story. They thought he might have had a conflict with Ezekiel and was seeking revenge. However, they needed to confirm his claims, so detectives brought John Carpenter in for further questioning. A startling confession emerged. At first, Carpenter maintained the same story he had told a year ago, but when detectives presented him with Giovanni's testimony, his attitude noticeably shifted. He paused and questioned, "What kind of sentence will I get for concealing a crime? Is there a way to lessen it if I cooperate?" Understanding the seriousness of his predicament, Carpenter made a deal with the police. In return for a lighter sentence, he promised to provide all the information he had and to disclose the location of Kathy's remains. Carpenter tried hard to downplay his involvement in the events, maintaining that he never intended to lie to the investigators. He explained that he chose to stay silent out of fear that Ezekiel might hurt him as well. Carpenter stated that Ezekiel came home around midnight that night, covered in mud. He also remembered noticing a recent cut near Ezekiel's ear, which had been overlooked during the investigation because Ezekiel had a beard back then. Ezekiel Watkins confided in his roommate, John Carpenter, about a shocking incident that could change everything. He asked John for help and requested a small shovel from the trunk of his car. The two then made their way to a marshy area behind the park, walking through about 50 yards of thick underbrush. They stopped near the body of Katie Chou. Ezekiel explained that her death was accidental and that he was only acting in self-defense. He pleaded with John to help him conceal the body. Together, they dragged Katie's body further into the dense thicket, covering several more yards until it became nearly impossible to move. There, they dug a shallow grave, placed her inside, and covered her with dirt, branches. Even a year later, John could show investigators the exact burial location by using a large fallen tree as a reference point. Ezekiel was arrested the same day, but firmly maintained that he did not commit a crime, claiming it was an accident. He acknowledged that he had agreed to meet Kathy after she texted him, but he stated that she was aggressive and confrontational during their encounter. Ezekiel mentioned that Kathy was still trying to resolve their differences and had expressed this to him. To keep a low profile, Ezekiel suggested they walk to a nearby marshy area to talk. However, the argument intensified once they arrived. Ezekiel said that Kathy's behavior became even more intense. At one point, he took out a knife he always carried, claiming he did not intend to harm her but wanted to frighten her enough to leave him alone so he could go. When Kathy saw the knife, she allegedly rushed at him and hit his arm, resulting in him accidentally cutting himself. A struggle followed. Ezekiel claimed he didn't know how the knife ended up in Kathy's neck. When he realized she was no longer breathing, he panicked. Instead of calling for help, he went home and asked John for help without fully explaining the situation. Although shocked, John agreed to help him hide the body. Together, they created a false story and stuck to it. Giovanni Candelario was staying in their apartment without anyone's knowledge, so he was not questioned by the police during the early investigation. When Kathy's body was found in a shallow grave, it was in such an advanced state of decomposition that DNA testing was necessary to confirm her identity. However, the forensic evidence contradicted Ezekiel's account of what happened. The medical examiner found more than a dozen knife wounds on Kathy, including a fatal cut to her throat, which was likely the cause of her death. This was clearly not an accident. It was a brutal and deliberate act. Despite the substantial evidence against him, Ezekiel maintained his innocence, claiming it was self-defense and that Kathy was accidentally hurt during their struggle. Investigators also discovered that the last message sent from Kathy's phone to her father was actually written and sent by Ezekiel, indicating he was trying to delay the discovery of her disappearance. During the trial, Ezekiel admitted that Kathy had been stalking him and trying to interfere with his new relationship. However, he denied that he had meant to hurt her. Giovanni, who provided important information, was not charged and remained a witness in the case. John Carpenter, who was Ezekiel's roommate and agreed to help investigators, received a suspended sentence for hiding evidence and lying in his testimony. Ezekiel Watkins pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder. However, Watkins was eventually convicted and sentenced to 27 years in prison. As a result, without the possibility of parole, Watkins remains incarcerated at the Washington Correctional Center in Shelton, Washington. Kathy Chou's life, radiant and full of promise, was stolen in 2010 by the one she once trusted, Ezekiel Watkins. His betrayal, a knife through her heart and her family's, left Renton, Washington, reeling for her Taiwanese immigrant parents, who cradled dreams of a better life. Kathy's loss was a wound deepened by their silent isolation. Her social media posts, a cry for freedom, led investigators to her killer but revealed the perils of her digital world. Renton's community, united in grief, lit candles at vigils and plastered her smile on flyers, refusing to let her fade. Giovanni Candelario's courage unveiled the truth, securing Ezekiel's 27-year sentence. Kathy's spirit endures in Renton High's quiet memorials and new safety lessons, whispering to us all, cherish those who shine, guard their trust, and hold fast to hope in the face of heartbreak. What keeps a marriage together when love, trust, and respect are absent? Some people attempt to maintain the family for the sake of their children, while others worry about what others might think. Additionally, some may feel restrained by their religious beliefs, or a combination of these factors. However, the intense desire to save a marriage at any cost can sometimes lead to devastating outcomes. The story of Jacqueline and Paul Krimble is not one of a kind, but it gained a lot of attention because of its brutal nature, greed, and lack of morals. The perpetrator was called the Black Widow and was imprisoned. However, in a revealing interview, her daughter admitted that Jacqueline showed her cruelty even while in prison. Jacqueline, known as Jackie, was born in 1974 in County Armagh, Northern Ireland. She was the youngest of two children in a typical middle-class family. Since childhood, Jacqueline displayed erratic, spoiled, defiant, and occasionally aggressive behavior. As a teenager, her actions became increasingly unmanageable, but her family attributed this to typical adolescent issues, believing she would eventually outgrow it. In high school, Jacqueline met Paul Crimble, who was 3 years older than her and very different in personality. Despite their differences, they were drawn to each other, a classic example of opposites attracting. Paul was humble and shy. Coming from a religious background, he was a good student, recognized for his talents. Jacqueline's boldness, confidence captivated him. She was the first girl he had serious feelings for, and likely the only one. Jacqueline's parents were supportive of her relationship with Paul, believing he would help her become more calm and sensible. It often felt like they treated Paul better than Jacqueline, welcoming him into the family from the very first meeting. In contrast, Paul's parents were cautious about his choice, but they allowed the relationship to continue. Friends from school noticed that Jacqueline and Paul seemed mismatched. Jacqueline frequently instigated conflicts and preferred to settle matters with physical confrontations, while Paul always sought peaceful solutions. He was known for being friendly, open-minded, and responsible, consistently keeping his promises and ready to lend a helping hand. Paul was described as a kind, sensible, and mature young man, displaying wisdom beyond his years. At 17, Jacqueline became pregnant by her boyfriend, Paul, who was 20 and already in college. She told him right away. Upon hearing the news, Paul immediately stated that he was ready to marry her, take full responsibility for her and the baby. Jacqueline felt unprepared for family life and raising a child. However, terminating the pregnancy was not an option for her, as neither she nor Paul, belonging to a religious family, could consider it. Paul decided to buy an engagement ring and proposed to Jacqueline, who accepted. They had a simple wedding in 1992, celebrating with their closest family and friends. A few days before the event, Paul shared with his best friend that he and Jacqueline were fundamentally different in many ways. He had doubts about how genuine her feelings were and even felt afraid of her temper. Paul also questioned whether his feelings for her were true love or simply sympathy and obligation. Since he had never been in a relationship with anyone else, he had no basis for comparison. His friend listened carefully and cautioned Paul against going through with the marriage, suggesting it could be the biggest mistake of his life and might lead to lifelong unhappiness. Despite this advice, Paul was resolute. He felt he couldn't abandon Jacqueline, who was expecting their child. He believed that becoming a mother would positively change Jacqueline, making her more gentle and calm. Paul hoped for a positive future, but he was unaware of how mistaken he was. Family life without love began to reveal itself. In early 1993, they had their first child, a daughter named Danielle. 6 years later, Jacqueline gave birth to their son. Paul worked hard to support his family and ensured they had everything they needed. After their second child was born, the Crimbles decided to move to a larger home and bought a cozy 3-bedroom townhouse in Armagh, relocating in 2000. By that time, Paul had a senior position in mechanical engineering and was earning a good salary. Meanwhile, his wife chose not to work, saying she preferred to take care of the household and the children. Unfortunately, she wasn't very good at these tasks. Jacqueline was often selfish, lazy, quick-tempered, and displayed aggression, even toward their children. As the children got older, Jacqueline attempted to find a job, but her argumentative and confrontational nature led to her being frequently unemployed. Instead of working, she spent most evenings at bars, drinking alcohol, while her husband stayed home to care for their daughter and son. When sober, Jacqueline was not very pleasant, but when she drank, she became aggressive, instigating conflicts, getting into fights, using offensive language, and behaving inappropriately with various men. Any attempts to ask her to behave more appropriately were met with hostility, making her unpredictable. Neighbors and family friends were aware of the situation, felt sympathy for Paul and the children, who were most affected by Jacqueline's behavior. Living in a small, quiet town, many people knew about her troubles and tried to steer clear of her. Her negative reputation impacted her husband and children, causing them to face issues with their peers at school. Jacqueline instilled fear in her family, as she could become aggressive at any time. Paul tried to tolerate the situation, but it was evident to his friends, family, and co-workers that he was uncomfortable around Jacqueline, or even when she was mentioned. Many advised him to leave her, but Paul was worried about losing custody of their children. During disagreements, Jacqueline would quickly threaten to prevent him from seeing their daughter and son. She also warned him that she could enlist her male acquaintances from bars to harm him. Consequently, Paul often surrendered to her demands and remained quiet. On the morning of June 20th, 2004, Jacqueline called emergency services, urgently asking for help. She reported that 3 strangers had invaded her home, attacking both her and her husband. They had tied them up and attempted to rob them before escaping in their car, taking her husband with them. When police officers and medics arrived at their home, they found Jacqueline with her hands bound behind her back using a plastic cable tie, but her legs were free, suggesting she had managed to partially escape. Interestingly, she showed no visible injuries or bruises, despite claiming that the attackers had beaten them. Thankfully, their children were not at home, as they had gone to spend the weekend with their paternal grandparents. Jacqueline recounted that the night before, she and her husband had gone to a bar to unwind. After having a few drinks, they returned home after midnight. As Paul was about to open the front door, 3 masked individuals suddenly emerged from the shadows and forced their way inside. The intruders, armed with a gun, restrained the couple, physically attacked them, demanded money, and banned substance. Paul attempted to compromise with them, pleading for their release and promising not to contact the police. But this only made the attackers more aggressive. They struck him multiple times and began to suffocate him with a plastic bag, while Jacqueline looked on in horror. When the intruders realized there was no cash or illegal substances in the house, they decided to take the car, but inexplicably took Paul with them, leaving Jacqueline tied up and alone. After the criminals took Paul away, Jacqueline was able to reach the phone and call the police, using her toe to dial. She believed her husband might still be alive and urgently pleaded with the detectives to rescue him. Despite her frantic situation, Jacqueline seemed unusually calm, but the authorities found no reason to doubt her at the time. The investigators to start gathering evidence at the crime scene. They sought any information about the attackers, but Jacqueline stated that the criminals wore masks and she couldn't remember any distinguishing features like their clothing, speech, or physical traits. All she could confirm was that there were 3 male assailants. By Monday morning, less than a day after the attack, the search had begun. The Crimble family's car was found abandoned 3 miles from their home, parked in a deserted alley next to an empty house. Inside the trunk, authorities discovered the mutilated body of Paul. He showed clear signs of beating and torture. His hands were tied behind his back, his legs were bound with a cable tie, and his body was marked with numerous bruises. These criminals left no evidence behind, which was odd. When Jacqueline was informed about this horrifying discovery, she remained calm. It seemed that the violent loss of her husband, the father of her children, did not affect her much. Although she attempted to show surprise and grief, she did not shed a single tear and instead asked when she would be able to get her car back. Her unusual reaction raised suspicions, leading the police to scrutinize her. At first, Jacqueline's story was accepted without question and regarded as the only trustworthy version of events. However, her odd behavior as a widowed mother of 2 raised doubts among law enforcement, leading them to suspect she might be dishonest. Investigations revealed that her marriage to Paul had been deteriorating for a long time, and she was not an exemplary wife or mother. Neighbors, acquaintances, even her own children and parents had negative things to say about her. Additionally, it emerged that Jacqueline had been involved with a man named Roger Ferguson for several months. Roger, who lived with his mother on a farm in Armagh, was frequently seen with Jacqueline at various entertainment spots in town, where they were drinking. He would also visit her at home while her husband was at work and the children were at school and daycare. A day after the disfigured body was discovered in a car, Jacqueline went from being seen as a victim to the primary suspect, with Roger now viewed as a potential accomplice. While there were no reports of suspicious individuals seen in town, nearly everyone who had interacted with the victim shared negative opinions about her. It was soon discovered that the deceased man had an insurance policy worth $300,000 British pound, which would go to his wife upon his death. This created a potential motive for the investigation. Before, Jacqueline stated that she was able to call for help by using her toe on a button phone. However, during the first inspection of the crime scene, investigators observed that the phone was on the coffee table face down, while her hands were tied behind her back. This made it impossible for her to have flipped the phone over after making the call or to have dialed for help if it had been in that position from the beginning. Their computer search history showed unusual inquiries. Someone had been searching for information about life insurance payouts and procedures related to the death of a policyholder for several months. When Jacqueline was questioned about this, she insisted she had no knowledge of it and suggested that Paul might be interested. Roger, suspected of being an accomplice in the crime, had a strong alibi. His mother stated that he had stayed home all night because he was feeling unwell. She mentioned that, around 1:30 a.m., she was looking in the medicine cabinet for something to treat his stomach problems. Despite her convincing account, police did not remove her son from the list of suspects. The police tracked the suspects' locations on the night of the crime using their cell phone signals and found that Roger was not at home, as his mother had claimed. Instead, he was at the Crimble's house for several hours. Roger continued his relationship with Jacqueline, and they were seen together at a bar the day after Paul's funeral. Interestingly, Jacqueline and Roger also visited a car dealership together to look at SUVs and discuss financing options for such a costly purchase. Roger's mother was with them during this visit, which raised further suspicions. The police believed that they had already made plans for how to use the insurance money following Paul's death, and they suspected that Roger's mother was likely aware of this. During interrogations, Jacqueline maintained that she never cheated on her husband and had no intention of harming him, but no one believed her anymore. Before the tragedy, she had started a job as a caregiver at a nursing home, but was fired within weeks due to ongoing conflicts and dishonesty. Despite this, she didn't inform her husband and pretended to go to work or have night shifts while staying at her lover Roger's house. Her deception was uncovered by chance when Paul met one of Jacqueline's former colleagues, who revealed the truth to him. When Paul confronted Jacqueline, it led to another heated argument. She threatened to leave him for her lover, take the children, and prevent him from interacting with them, which became Paul's biggest fear. To avoid losing his family, he chose to overlook her infidelity and could only confide in his closest friend, who later served as a witness in court, recounting Paul's situation. A cunning plan was in the works. Roger was not very bright. He was somewhat gullible and easily influenced. Jacqueline quickly took control over him, using her charm to make him do whatever she wanted. He would readily fight for her, which made her feel important. He was likely in love with her and believed everything she said. Meanwhile, Jacqueline complained to Roger about her husband, claiming he was rude, cruel, even abusive. Although these accusations were untrue, with each complaint, Roger grew to hate Paul more, thinking he was hurting Jacqueline and was the main reason for their unhappiness. Jacqueline planted the idea in Roger's mind that if her husband were gone, all their problems would disappear, allowing them to be together while also gaining a significant amount of money for a comfortable life. About 2 weeks before the tragedy, Jacqueline looked for people to help her commit the crime for money. However, after thinking it over, she and Roger decided against that plan. They believed they could do it themselves without leaving evidence or witnesses, ensuring they would receive the full insurance payout. On Friday, June 18th, Jacqueline took the children to spend the weekend with their grandparents. On Saturday, she encouraged her husband, Paul, to go out for drinks, to unwind and have a conversation. Paul happily agreed, believing it could improve their relationship, but he didn't realize it was a setup for something far worse. That night, patrons at the bar observed Jacqueline making significant efforts to intoxicate her husband, who doesn't drink. She bought multiple drinks and nearly forced him to take one shot after another. After midnight, she helped her unsteady husband leave the bar, and they were captured on surveillance cameras. This was the last time Paul was seen alive. The investigation uncovered a major timing issue. The bar was a 10-minute walk from the Krimble home, and the attack happened right after they returned, lasting no more than 15 minutes. Jacqueline stated that her husband was kidnapped afterward and taken away in their car, prompting her to call the police immediately. However, there was a gap of about an hour and a half between when they were captured on camera and when she contacted the police. Investigators suspected that this time was used by the perpetrators to cover up their actions and make the attack appear to have been committed by other individuals. Additionally, it seemed that Jacqueline deliberately got her husband drunk so he would be unable to fight back. She claimed that the attackers kicked Paul while he was incapacitated and then began to strangle him by placing a plastic bag over his head and securing it with tape. The injuries found on the deceased confirmed her story, but by that point, the police were almost certain that the attackers were Jacqueline and her lover, Roger Ferguson. After a thorough investigation of the crime scene, clear evidence was uncovered. Detectives found a partially erased footprint of a man's shoe that had been poorly cleaned. The tread pattern matched Roger's shoes, but this alone is considered circumstantial evidence. More concrete evidence against the criminal couple emerged as well. In the kitchen trash, detectives discovered a cigarette butt with Roger's saliva on it, and a partial fingerprint from him was located on the cable tie that bound Jacqueline's hands. Additionally, Roger's fingerprints were found on the ties that bound the victim's hands and feet. The bag used to suffocate the victim contained sweat and oil traces from both of the suspects. The investigation revealed another person involved in this violent crime, Colin Robinson, 17, a minor acquaintance of Roger. On the night of the attack, Roger called Colin to ask for an unspecified favor. Following Roger's instructions, Colin parked his car at the end of the street and walked to the house to avoid drawing attention. However, when Colin realized the situation, he wanted to escape, but Roger threatened him with a knife and coerced him into helping move the body into the car's trunk. Afterward, they drove the car to a secluded area and abandoned it. Initially, Colin denied any involvement in the crime, but during a second interrogation, he broke down and started to confess. The trial and sentencing took place after a thorough investigation that lasted several months. During this period, investigators collected solid evidence, interviewed witnesses, and obtained a confession from the third person involved in the crime. However, the trial only started in spring 2007, nearly 3 years after Paul Krimble was killed. On May 7, 2007, Jacqueline Krimble and Roger Ferguson were convicted of premeditated murder with the intent of collecting insurance money. Jacqueline received a 20-year prison sentence, while Roger, her lover and accomplice, was sentenced to 18 years. Colin Robinson, the young accomplice, received a 3-year sentence for aiding the criminals and trying to conceal the criminal. Additionally, Roger's elderly mother was also held accountable for perjury and giving a false alibi for her son. Given her old age and serious health issues, she was sentenced to only 1 year of probation. Jacqueline sought revenge on her own children. Even while in prison, she felt bitterness towards her family for not supporting her during her trial and for their relief at her imprisonment. Her own mother even stated that people like Jacqueline should be kept away from society to prevent them from causing harm. Strikingly, just days after her husband's funeral, Jacqueline destroyed all of his belongings and photographs, wanting nothing to remind her of him. However, Danielle managed to save a few pictures of her father, hiding them in her bedside table without her mother's knowledge. The £300,000 British insurance payout, for which Paul was murdered, went to his children. The children lost both of their parents in an instant, but their difficulties continued. Their mother was fiercely opposed to allowing either her parents or the parents of her deceased husband to take care of them. She fought hard to deny them guardianship rights, which led to the children entering foster care, even though they had living grandparents. At the time of the tragedy, Danielle was just 11 years old, and her brother was only 5. Jacqueline managed to keep her parental rights and tried to manipulate her children from prison. She wanted them to publicly claim her innocence and used various pressure tactics to do so. For instance, she promised to approve their school trips if they visited her in prison, but she tricked them. During the visit, she insisted they testify for her and refused to sign the permission slip. As a result, they were the only ones in their class who couldn't go on weekend trips. Danielle is now living in Basingstoke, working at a daycare and in a relationship with Simon Bryce, an engineer, her brother, who has a solid education and has relocated to London. The harrowing tale of Jacqueline and Paul Crimble underscores the devastating consequences of a marriage sustained by obligation rather than love, trust, or respect. Jacqueline's calculated murder of her husband, driven by greed for a £300,000 insurance payout and executed with chilling ruthlessness alongside her lover, Roger Ferguson, not only claimed Paul's life, but also irreparably fractured their family. The children, Danielle, and her younger brother were left to grapple with the loss of their devoted father and the betrayal of a mother whose cruelty persisted even from behind bars. Despite inheriting the insurance money, no financial remedy could heal the emotional wounds inflicted by Jacqueline's actions or restore the stability stolen from their childhoods. This case serves as a stark cautionary tale. Clinging to a toxic relationship under the guise of duty or societal pressure can lead to catastrophic outcomes, leaving a trail of heartbreak and irreparable loss. The discovery of 5 lifeless bodies inside a large house in New Zealand became one of the strangest and most expensive criminal cases the country had ever faced. David Bain was the eldest son and the only survivor of the incident. Shockingly, David was later charged with 5 counts of murder, accused of killing his entire family. He was only 22 years old at the time. But if you think that's where the story ends, think again. 19 years later, David walked free, and the reason why is astonishing. It's one of those cases that makes you question everything. Trust me, you'll want to grit your teeth and hang on until the very end. But before we dive into the shocking twists and turns, let's first take a closer look at the Bain family, the people at the heart of this chilling mystery. By all appearances, the Bain family seemed like a typical religious family. David Cullen Bain was born on March 27, 1972, the first child of Robin Bain and Margaret Bain. His parents had married 3 years earlier. In 1969, they were deeply rooted in their faith, hoping for a peaceful, close-knit family life. But life had other plans. When David was 2 years old, Robin felt called to be a missionary teacher, so the family moved far away from home. The Bains uprooted their lives and moved over 3,000 miles northwest to Papua New Guinea. It was a massive change, from the familiar streets of New Zealand to the tropical and often challenging environment of a remote island nation. Their family grew. David became the eldest of 4 siblings, with 2 sisters, Arawa and Laniette, born 3 and 4 years after him. A younger brother, Stephen, arriving 8 years later. In many ways, this should have been a time of joy and growth, but beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. While Robin threw himself into his missionary work, Margaret's spiritual path began to shift. She became fascinated by New Age spiritualism and the idea of channeling spirits, a stark contrast to the traditional religious values the family was raised with. Margaret became convinced that their family was under threat from dark, satanic forces and fiercely believed that they needed protection from these evil influences. This obsession caused stress and fear at home, creating a sense of discomfort that intensified as time passed. Additionally, Robin's enthusiasm for his missionary work started to fade after several years. The dream that had brought the family to Papua New Guinea began to lose its luster. By 1988, 14 years after their move, they returned to New Zealand. The family settled into a large house in Anderson's Bay, a quiet suburb on New Zealand's South Island. It was supposed to be a fresh start, but life at home was far from peaceful. In 1991, Robin took a job as the principal of a small rural school. On paper, this sounded promising: a stable job, a chance to rebuild a community. But things were deteriorating rapidly. By 1994, the marriage between Robin and Margaret was hanging by a thread. They argued constantly, daily fights that wore down the family's spirit. Margaret's bitterness toward Robin had deepened so much that she reportedly made chilling comments about wanting to kill him. The tension was strong, and they could feel it both emotionally and in the atmosphere of their home. Visitors described the Bain household as a pigsty. The once grand house had become run down and neglected. Broken windows, peeling paint, and clutter filled every corner. Unpleasant smells lingered in the air, a testament to the family's neglect and disarray. Robin was rarely there to help. During the week, he lived and slept in a caravan near the school, miles away from the chaos at home. On weekends, instead of joining the family inside, he stayed in another caravan parked in the garden. The emotional distance between the family members only grew wider. Worse, dark rumors swirled around Robin. There were whispers and accusations of abuse towards his youngest daughter. And yet, these claims cast a shadow over the family and would later become a key element in the case that shocked the nation. On the other hand, David's relationship with his father was tense and strained. In contrast, he was very close to his mother, Margaret, and they often shared grievances about Robin, united in their frustrations. At 22 years old in 1994, David was trying to find his way. He was a music student with dreams of becoming an opera singer, an ambitious goal that set him apart from the typical path his siblings were on. Whether or not he had the talent for international fame is up for debate, but David's passion for music was real. Now, despite the turmoil at home, all 4 Bain children were involved in school or work. Arawa was training to be a teacher, Stephen was finishing high school, and Laniet held a part-time job. However, David's path was a little more complicated. After struggling to fit in at university, he had dropped out for a time and even relied on unemployment benefits. But he eventually returned to university to study classical music, supporting himself by delivering newspapers in the early mornings, a humble job that required discipline and grit. By 1994, the bond between Robin and Margaret was not just broken, it was shattered beyond repair. Margaret had become really convinced that Robin was possessed by a demon she called Balil. She also referred to her husband as a son of Balil, one of the 4 crowned princes of hell. This wasn't some passing thought or simple fear, it was something she wrote about repeatedly in her diary, describing how she believed her husband was under the control of an evil spirit, that it cast a dark shadow over their home and tore the family apart. Margaret's attempts to rid Robin of this demon often took the form of exorcisms, rituals meant to drive the evil out. Robin's mental health suffered immensely under this strain. Colleagues at his school described him as a man who was depressed, withdrawn, and barely functioning, like a shell of the person he once was. Neglecting his own hygiene and appearing almost robotic, Robin seemed lost, trapped in a life that was falling apart around him. Meanwhile, the children found themselves caught in the middle of this toxic environment. David, Arawa, Laniet, and Stephen each had their own complicated relationships with their parents and with each other. Some children sided more with their mother, others were closer to their father. The house, already cluttered and chaotic, was filled with tension and emotional pain. It was clear that the family was on the brink of collapse. And then, on the morning of Monday, June 20th, 1994, the unimaginable happened. At exactly 7:09 in the morning, David Bain made a frantic call to emergency services. All dead. They're all dead. I can't believe they're all dead. David trying to explain what he had found in his own home. When police arrived, they were confronted with a scene so grim and tragic that it was almost unimaginable. David's mother, sisters, and youngest brother were all dead. His father lay in the lounge, a bullet wound to the head. The family rifle was on the floor beside him, and chillingly, a typed message on the computer read, "Sorry, you are the only one who deserves to stay." The family home was a mess, as usual, but now it was stained with loss and violence. All 5 members of the Bain family were dead, victims of a brutal shooting that shocked the entire nation. The question everyone wanted answered was, who did this and why? In the days following the massacre, more evidence emerged that suggested Robin, the father, might have been innocent after all. Remarkably, the only blood found on him was his own. There was none on his clothes, socks, or shoes which he had been wearing that day. This was puzzling because if Robin had been the killer and had then shot himself, one would expect at least some transfer of blood to his clothing or hands. Moreover, Robin's fingerprints were completely absent from the rifle found beside him, a fact that forensic experts found hard to reconcile. If Robin had fired the fatal shots and then turned the weapon on himself, his fingerprints should have been all over the gun. To complicate matters further, no gunpowder residue was detected on his hands, a forensic detail that contradicted the idea of him taking his own life. The initial theory seemed clear. The father, Robin, had killed his family before taking his own life. But this explanation quickly began to unravel. Forensic experts examined the bullet wound in Robin's head and declared it nearly impossible that he had shot himself. The trajectory and angle of the bullet, along with the blood patterns, suggested his body had been moved after death, casting doubt on the father theory. This twist in the investigation shifted suspicion towards David Bain. If Robin wasn't the killer, then why was David alive when everyone else in his family was dead? Why had he been spared to add to the growing mystery? David's story just didn't quite add up. When officers first questioned him, he explained that he had completed his usual newspaper round between 6 and 6:42 in the morning. This timeline seemed straightforward enough, and a neighbor even confirmed to police that they saw David entering the Bain property at around 6:40 a.m. But here's where things get strange. David didn't call for help until 7:09 a.m., a full 24 minutes after he supposedly returned home. What happened during that gap? When interrogated, David admitted he zoned out, unsure of what to do or how to react to the horror inside his own house. This delay immediately raised red flags for investigators, who wondered if something was being left out of his story. Adding more complexity to the case, David was unable to explain the fresh injuries on his forehead and knees. These wounds suggested some kind of recent struggle or accident, but he had no clear explanation. Even more incriminating was the fact that the gun found next to Robin's body actually belonged to David. He further admitted he was the only person who knew where the key to unlock the gun's safety mechanism was kept, making him the prime suspect in the eyes of the police. With this mounting suspicion, it didn't take long for the authorities to detain David. Merely 4 days after the horrific massacre, he was arrested and charged with the murders of his entire family. Digital forensics played a crucial role in unraveling the tangled timeline of that tragic morning. It was discovered that the computer on which the final letter was typed had been switched on at 6:44 a.m., just 2 minutes after David reportedly arrived home. This suggested that the note had been composed shortly after his return, seemingly placing him at the scene during the time of the killings. Despite all the mounting evidence casting doubt on Robin's guilt, the investigation took a dark turn just 17 days after the murders. The Bain family's relatives, deeply unsettled by the gruesome scene, decided to take drastic action. Relatives, worried about teenagers breaking in and accidentally causing a fire or other problems, asked for the house to be deliberately burned down in a safe, controlled manner. The decision was approved by David himself, who agreed to this controversial move. While it might seem illogical to burn down a crime scene, the family and authorities wanted to prevent further tragedy or vandalism. Within minutes, the old wooden Bain family home was engulfed in roaring flames. The blaze quickly consumed the house, erasing the physical space where such a horrific tragedy had unfolded. The house was consumed by towering flames for more than an hour. The fire could be seen over most of the city. It burned 17 days after Arawa, Laniette, and Stephen were killed, along with parents Robin and Margaret. Still, with the house now reduced to ashes, the investigators could only rely on the evidence they had already gathered. No further forensic work could be done on the physical crime scene, as it no longer existed. How the family managed to get permission to burn down a crime scene so fast, or why anyone even thought it was a good idea, remains a total mystery. Despite all this, the wheels of justice kept turning. Almost 1 year to the day after the massacre, in May of 1995, David's trial finally began. Prosecutors came well prepared and carefully reconstructed a timeline of the horrific morning. According to their version, David woke at 5 a.m. to the familiar buzz of his alarm clock. After dressing, he put on a pair of white opera gloves, a strange and unsettling choice, and retrieved his rifle. Along with the ammunition from his wardrobe, using a spare key, he unlocked the gun's trigger lock, effectively readying himself for what would become a brutal and bloody spree. David systematically shot his mother, then his 2 sisters, and finally his younger brother. During a violent struggle with his brother Stephen, David lost a lens from his glasses and suffered several injuries himself. Blood from the victims soaked into David's clothes, a damning detail prosecutors emphasized to prove his involvement. Trying to cover his tracks, David supposedly threw the bloodied clothes into the washing machine, started a cycle, took a shower, and changed into fresh, clean clothes. These actions explain the pools of blood found scattered throughout the laundry room and bathroom, places no one would expect unless someone was desperately trying to erase evidence. After this cleanup, David reportedly went about his usual morning routine, leaving the house at 5:45 a.m. to deliver newspapers as if nothing was wrong. Upon returning home at approximately 6:42 a.m., he went upstairs and switched on the computer at 6:44 a.m., then typed a message. Then he waited for his father, Robin, to return. Robin was known to enter the house from his caravan at exactly 7 a.m. every morning to pray, and tragically, that day was no different. Prosecutors argued that David hid behind a curtain in the lounge, silently waiting for Robin to nearby. At that precise moment, he shot his father at point-blank range. Only then did he make the call to emergency services, feigning shock and despair. This call coincided with the 24-minute gap. David claimed he had zoned out, unsure of what to do next. Afterward, David allegedly staged the scene to make it look like Robin had taken his own life. But David tells a completely different story. He told the court that he had gotten up at his usual time, prepared for his paper route, and left the house with his dog. Upon returning around 6:42 a.m., he went straight to his room, took off his shoes, and went downstairs to wash his hands. While he admitted putting his clothes into the washing machine, he denied they had any blood on them. Heading back upstairs, he claimed he noticed bullets and the rifle's trigger lock lying on the floor. Frantically, he searched the house and found his mother, sisters, and brother all dead in their bedrooms. His father was also dead, lying in the lounge. According to David, he then zoned out for about 20 minutes before finally calling emergency services. Additionally, David's defense team proposed a shocking alternative, that Robin, the father, was actually the killer. According to their theory, Robin had killed his family before turning on the computer to type a message and then had taken his own life. It was a bold claim, but several parts of David's story just didn't add up. The prosecution, meanwhile, argued that David's motive was financial. They claimed he wanted to inherit the family fortune. His parents had put away a large sum of money intended for a new house. When the trial ended, David Bain was found guilty on all 5 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole after 16 years. Now, you might think the story ends there. A horrific family massacre, an obvious suspect, and a clear sentence. Case closed, but you'd be wrong. Over the months and years that followed, David Bain's case captivated many. news of the Bain family massacre spread like wildfire across the nation, and public opinion was sharply divided on who was truly to blame. One of David's most vocal supporters was Chou, a former All-Black rugby star. After retiring from professional sports, Chou developed a deep interest in the case during his more relaxed years. Convinced of David's innocence, Chou became an outspoken advocate. Following David's sentencing, Chou visited him over 200 times in prison. He even wrote 4 books about the case, tirelessly researching and pressuring the justice system for a review. His efforts eventually led to a major breakthrough, an appeal to the Privy Council. This appeal, which began in May 2007, 12 years after David's initial imprisonment, was a monumental moment. The Privy Council, based in London, found that a serious miscarriage of justice had occurred. They ordered David's convictions to be quashed and scheduled a new trial. The council argued there was significant doubt David would have been convicted if crucial evidence, discovered after the original trial, had been presented to the jury. Much of this new evidence was information the jury had never even heard. For example, Dean Cottle, a friend of Laniet, revealed something explosive. According to Dean, Laniet had confided in him about an incestuous relationship with her father, Robin. Just days before the massacre, she had traveled home to confront the family with this horrific secret. This testimony suggested a possible motive for Robin, but the judge, in the original trial, ruled Dean's evidence as hearsay and labeled him an unreliable witness. As a result, this crucial information was suppressed and never reached the jury. As time passed, even more disturbing facts came to light. Robin had reportedly published brutal and sadistic stories written by his pupils in a school newsletter. One of these stories even involved a fictional family massacre. A 46-page document detailed the many wrongdoings of the first trial, painting a clear picture of its inherent unfairness. None of this information was available to the jury in 1995, meaning David's defense team couldn't properly shift suspicion towards Robin. Consequently, David was granted bail and allowed to remain out of prison while awaiting the new trial. This brief taste of freedom, after spending over a decade behind bars, must have felt almost surreal. For 3 months, he lived with Chou and then moved to Auckland. This fleeting liberty was likely a bittersweet experience, shadowed by the heavy knowledge that his nightmare was far from over. 2 years later, in March 2009, David's retrial commenced, forcing him and everyone connected to the case to relive the horrors once again. David pleaded not guilty to the 5 murder charges. Again, his defense argued that Robin, the father, was the true killer who had then turned the gun on himself. This time, however, the defense brought forward far more compelling evidence, suggesting why Robin might have committed such a chilling act. They detailed Robin's descent into a deep and morbid depression, his alarming behavior that concerned colleagues and friends, and most importantly, they uncovered the secret at the heart of it all, Laniet's dark and hidden truth, which she was allegedly ready to reveal to the family just before the massacre. This secret, steeped in horror and despair, painted a picture of a man pushed to the edge by desperation and shame. The retrial dragged on for 3 grueling months, filled with testimony, arguments, and re-examinations of every detail. Yet, despite the lengthy process, the jury's decision was astonishingly swift. Less than a day after deliberation, they returned with a unanimous verdict of not guilty. After spending 13 years in prison and 2 additional years under legal suspicion, David Bain was finally free. Since then, he has lived outside the prison walls, rebuilding his life piece by piece. However, the case continues to divide opinion sharply. There are still many details that make it hard for some to accept David's innocence. His bloody fingerprints were found on the murder weapon. Fresh injuries appeared on his body with no explanation, and Stephen's blood was discovered on clothes David had washed and denied having stained. What about the mysterious 20 minutes David claimed to have zoned out for? How does one explain that lapse during such a horrific day? More tellingly, experts have widely agreed that the angle of Robin's fatal wound made it almost impossible for him to have taken his own life. So, if Robin didn't kill himself, then who was responsible? Adding to the suspicion is the fact that David gave permission to burn down the family home, the very scene of the murders. To many, that act alone speaks volumes. Even David's girlfriend at the time said he had a premonition something terrible was about to happen shortly before the killings, which seems too coincidental to ignore. Yet, on the flip side, there are equally convincing reasons to believe Robin might have been the true culprit. Robin was reportedly deeply unhappy with his life, and if Laniet's secret was true, he could have been overwhelmed with panic and fear. Shell casings were found in his caravan, and the disturbing, sadistic stories revealed by his colleagues painted the portrait of a man unraveling mentally and emotionally. This case remains one of New Zealand's most polarizing, sparking intense debate over who truly committed the murders. The financial cost of this case was staggering. Taxpayers shelled out over $7 million, with the retrial alone costing more than $4 million, making it the most expensive trial in New Zealand's history. Joe Karam, David's unwavering advocate, lost over $500,000 personally supporting the cause. David himself sought compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. Given the high-profile nature of the case, New Zealand's Justice Minister brought in overseas judges to review the application. The review recommended compensation, but bureaucratic delays meant that the case was handed back and forth between ministers. 6 long years of red tape and delays passed before David was finally awarded $925,000 in 2016. During all this turmoil, David rebuilt his life. He found work as an engineer, fell in love, married, had a child, and legally changed his name. Rumor has it that the family eventually moved to Australia, perhaps to escape the long shadow cast by the case. As for the Bain family home, no trace remains of the original property that was burned down in 1994. The site has since been completely transformed into a landscaped, modern 3-bedroom house, erasing the physical memory of what happened there. Over the decades, the story of the Bain family massacre and all its related evidence has faded into the distant past, becoming almost like a dark legend whispered about but rarely confronted. It was just after 4:30 in the morning when the tracking app on Sade Robinson's phone suddenly went dark. Earlier that night, she had left work, excited about her first date with a man she'd recently met. By sunrise, her car was in flames, and along the shores of Lake Michigan, something unimaginable was waiting to be discovered. Sade Robinson was born in 2004 in Vicksburg, Mississippi. She is the daughter of Sheena Scarborough and Carlos Robinson. Her life changed early on, when she was just a year old. Her parents separated. Sade then moved with her mother to Milwaukee, settling into her grandparents' home. This city would become the backdrop of her formative years, and the place where her vibrant personality began to bloom. From the start, Sade stood out. She was curious, energetic, and always eager to learn about the world around her. She approached every activity, from soccer to Girl Scouts, with great enthusiasm. These early experiences not only allowed her to shine, but also helped shape her natural skills in leadership, teamwork, and discipline. Though Sade's father lived in Florida, she maintained a close bond with him. Frequent visits between states became a routine part of her life, and through them, she developed a rare sense of independence and responsibility at a young age. As she grew older, Sade's passions began to take clearer form. She was drawn to the arts, especially rap music and dance, where she could express herself freely. But her dreams weren't limited to the creative world. She also felt a deep desire to serve her country and envisioned herself someday joining the armed forces. Her academic record was equally impressive. Sade was known as a standout student, always focused and determined. Yet, even with her achievements, she wasn't immune to challenges. During 7th grade, she encountered difficulties at school. As a result, she made the brave decision to relocate to Florida, and live with her father, seeking a fresh start. Once again, Sade showed resilience in her new environment. She continued to excel, both socially and academically. Teachers and peers alike admired her focus, her ambition, and her quiet confidence, one that was rooted in strength rather than pride. In 2019, after spending several years in Florida, she returned to Milwaukee to live with her mother. When her final year of high school arrived in 2021, Sade poured herself into her studies, managing to graduate an entire semester early, yet another example of her unwavering determination. By 2024, at just 19 years old, Sade Robinson embodied a rare blend of discipline, ambition, and independence. She was pursuing a degree in art at Milwaukee Area Technical College, balancing her education with 2 full-time jobs. But her ambitions didn't stop there. She had already set her sights on a future in criminal law. Through sheer effort and careful, Sade was able to accomplish a major milestone. She bought her own car. It was more than just a vehicle. It represented her growing independence. Not long after, she moved out of her mother's home and rented her very own apartment. She balanced 2 demanding jobs to support herself. One of them was at Pizza Shuttle, where her work ethic, discipline, and initiative didn't go unnoticed. She quickly rose through the ranks and was promoted to manager. Her second job was at the prestigious Wisconsin Country Club, where she also helped her younger sister secure a position, making sure her sibling had access to the same opportunities that had shaped her own path. At that moment, her future looked incredibly bright. She had clear goals, the discipline to chase them, and the kind of maturity most people twice her age hadn't yet reached. Yet, behind all of that strength and focus, Sade still carried the hopes of any young woman her age. She dreamed of love, companionship, and a meaningful connection. What she never expected was that this search would lead her into the most dangerous moment of her life. April 1st, 2024 began like any other day for Sade. She started her morning shift at Pizza Shuttle, as she often did, took a few moments before work to catch up with her mother over FaceTime. Everything about the day seemed routine until the end of her shift. Sade was excited because she had a date planned that evening with a man she had recently met through a dating app. She left work to meet him. That would be the last time anyone in her group would see or hear from her. The following day, April 2nd, Sade didn't show up for her shift. She hadn't called in sick or left a message, which was completely out of character. Concern quickly spread among her co-workers. They began texting and calling her, hoping for an explanation, but there was no reply. Her family and close friends also began to worry. None of them had heard from her since the day before. As hours passed without a word, worry turned into panic. Those closest to her knew something was wrong. This was a chilling and inexplicable silence. As night fell and still no answers emerged, one of Sade's friends made the police and report her missing. Before doing so, she checked Sade's most recent social media activity and found something crucial: a Snapchat post of Sade. The timestamp was around 9 p.m. on the night of April 1st. That would be the final digital trace Sade left behind. On April 3rd, with no updates and mounting concern, police officers went to Sade's apartment. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer and no sounds from within. Unbeknownst to them, authorities elsewhere in the city had already made a horrifying discovery. At around 7:30 a.m. on April 2nd, 2024, the Milwaukee Fire Department received a report from local residents about a car on fire. When emergency crews arrived, they found thick smoke and flames engulfing a 2020 Honda Civic. The vehicle had been abandoned and was burning rapidly. Firefighters managed to contain the blaze. No one was inside the car, but the contents of the trunk raised immediate concern. A black coat, a pair of ripped jeans, and other women's clothing, charred but still identifiable. A cell phone, partially damaged by heat, was also recovered. The authorities now had physical evidence, but they still needed to know who the car belonged to. That answer would come soon, and it would change everything. Later that same day, Milwaukee County Sheriff's deputies were called to a different location. A man waiting for a friend had been walking along the edge of a park's beach when he stumbled upon something horrifying, a human leg lying near the shoreline. Forensic teams were called in, and after careful analysis, they determined the leg belonged to an African-American female. The remains were dismembered, but the condition of the limbs suggested the crime had occurred recently. As the investigation into Said's disappearance continued, one of the officers who had earlier visited her apartment learned of the discovery of the human remains. The physical description of the remains closely matched the details provided in the missing persons report for Said. Then, a second chilling confirmation arrived. The Honda Civic found burning that morning was registered to Said Robinson. With the pieces beginning to fall into place, detectives returned to her apartment. They spoke with the building's maintenance worker, who revealed that he had seen Said on the morning of April 1st. She seemed excited and said she was looking forward to a date after her shift. Investigators pulled the building's surveillance footage, which showed Said leaving her apartment at 9 p.m. On April 1st, she never returned. That footage, combined with the evidence from the car and the park, created an urgent new direction for the case. Authorities subpoenaed her phone records from her mobile carrier and traced her last text message to a number with a 262 area code. They didn't yet know who the number belonged to, but the content of the exchange made it clear it was the man she had planned to meet that night. Using that lead, police began cross-referencing phone data with surveillance footage. It soon emerged that Said and her date had met at a local venue called the Twisted Fisherman. Footage from the bar and witness statements from staff confirmed their presence there that evening. Another key piece of evidence came from the same friend who had filed the missing persons report. She revealed that she had access to Said's location through an app called Life 360, commonly used to track friends and family in real time. According to the app's log, the last known location for Said Robinson was Warnemont Park at 4:30 a.m. on April 2nd. A clearer timeline began to take shape. Investigators learned that she was originally scheduled to meet her date at 5 p.m. on April 1st at a place called Brad House. However, at the last minute, the man changed the location to a different venue, Twisted Fisherman, a bar where he had previously worked. He claimed he needed to stop by to pick up some paperwork. Said had no objection. At 5:20 p.m., she arrived at Twisted Fisherman. He was already there, waiting at the bar. The two sat side by side, ordered drinks and food, and chatted casually as the evening unfolded. Just over an hour later, they left the bar together, got into Said's car, and drove to a second location, Duke's, another bar. They spent roughly 3 hours at Duke's before heading to a residential neighborhood in southwestern Milwaukee, where they remained for several more hours. At some point in the early morning hours of April 2nd, Said's phone showed movement again, this time heading toward Warnemont Park. At 4:35, her Life 360 tracking app went silent. The battery had died. That was the last signal the phone would ever send. All signs pointed to one horrifying conclusion. Said Robinson had been murdered, and the person she had trusted enough to meet that night was now the prime suspect. Thanks to swift and coordinated work by law enforcement, the investigation progressed rapidly. Authorities had already zeroed in on one individual. Though his name was still unknown to the public, police knew he was the last person to see Said alive. The evidence they had gathered was enough to obtain both an arrest warrant and a search warrant for the residence traced from Said's phone activity. On April 4th at 1 p.m., officers moved in. They arrived at the suspect's home and took him into custody. His identity was finally confirmed. Maxwell Anderson, a 33-year-old man and the son of a well-known businessman in the region. Following his arrest, disturbing details about his background began to emerge. Throughout his life, Anderson had exhibited a pattern of problematic behavior. His own father had once tried to help him by giving him a position in the family business, but eventually fired him, stating that he was unfit for the job. Anderson was also a U.S. Navy veteran, but in recent years he had drifted from one job to the next, working primarily as a bartender in various establishments across Milwaukee. None of the positions lasted long. Between 2014 and 2019, he had multiple arrests on record, mostly for minor offenses such as public disorder and disturbances. Investigators worked to determine exactly how Sade and Anderson first met. The initial assumption was that they had connected through a dating app, but another theory surfaced. They may have crossed paths in person at one of the bars where Anderson had worked, locations that Sade and her friends were known to frequent. Following the arrest of Maxwell Anderson, detectives launched an extensive search of his residence. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. In one of the bedrooms, investigators discovered bloodstains on the bedding and on a wall leading down to the basement. That area, they soon realized, held even more disturbing clues. Inside the basement, they located multiple gas canisters and electric saws, items that raised immediate suspicion. The basement wasn't just a storage area, it appeared to have been prepared for something dark, something planned. The space, now a central point in the investigation, suggested that the crime against Sade had been both premeditated and executed with chilling precision. The search for evidence did not stop there. On April 6th, just days after the house search, investigators returned to the area where Sade's burned car had been discovered. Just 1 block away, they made another gruesome find: a human foot. The skin tone, size, and pink nail polish matched the severed leg recovered earlier. It belonged to Sade. Meanwhile, detectives continued to comb through surveillance footage near the scene of the car fire. It was here they uncovered a critical piece of evidence. Security cameras captured Maxwell Anderson stepping out of Sade's Honda Civic moments before setting it ablaze. Several bystanders in the area at the time later identified him as the man responsible. After starting the fire, Anderson was seen calmly walking away and boarding a nearby bus. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came from a key witness who knew Anderson personally. Alarmed by the news of Sade's disappearance, this individual immediately went to the police. What they shared would reshape the entire investigation. A month before the crime, on March 5th, Anderson had allegedly described a plan to lure a woman to his basement, shoot her, dismember her body, and scatter the remains across the city. At the time, it seemed like a disturbing joke. In retrospect, it was a blueprint. The witness went on to describe a visit to Anderson's house just days before the murder. The basement, they said, was covered in plastic sheeting. There were 3 saws in plain view, a large tarp, and an area staged with intimate objects, further suggesting the calculated nature of the crime. Authorities feared there could be additional victims and began re-examining other reports linked to Anderson. In February 2024, a woman came forward claiming that after meeting Anderson at a bar, he invited her to his home. Once there, she began to feel unwell, leading her to suspect he had drugged her drink. She escaped before anything could happen. That escape may have saved her life. With mounting evidence, physical, digital, and testimonial, the prosecution built a powerful case. On April 12th, just 10 days after Sade Robinson vanished, Maxwell Anderson was formally charged with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, and arson to conceal a crime. Though Anderson continued to claim innocence, the case against him was overwhelming. On the morning of June 6, 2025, the courtroom in Milwaukee was silent and tense. Families, reporters, and community members filled every seat. After months of grief, outrage, and unanswered questions, the moment had finally arrived. The jury had reached its decision. It took less than a day of deliberation. By 9:00 a.m. the next morning, their verdict was ready. Maxwell Anderson found guilty on all counts. First-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, hiding a corpse, arson. It was official. The man who had lured 19-year-old Sade Robinson on a first date only to brutally kill and dismember her was now legally responsible for one of the most horrifying crimes Milwaukee had ever seen. The trial had laid bare every excruciating detail. Jurors were shown hundreds of surveillance images and forensic photographs. They listened to the testimony of dozens of witnesses. They saw snapshots of Said in her final hours, alive, vulnerable, and unaware of the fate awaiting her. The prosecutor made the case clear. Saad was killed inside Anderson's home. He later dismembered her body, her remains, legs, arms, torso, even her right breast were scattered across counties. Some were found in the lake, others washed ashore, and in an attempt to erase it all, he set her car ablaze and walked away. Maxwell Anderson did not testify, and his defense team called no witnesses. His lawyer claimed the murder wasn't planned. However, the evidence suggested otherwise, revealing a sequence of events that started like any other night but culminated in horrifying violence. Said Robinson was ambitious and full of potential. She was a student at Milwaukee Area Technical College, held 2 jobs, and was actively shaping her future. That future was taken from her. Now, justice has been served. Sentencing is scheduled for August 15th, but for her loved ones, the real sentence is something far greater: life without her. Roberta Saggiasi grew up in the small town of Vasto, in the province of Chieti, Abruzzo, southeastern Italy. Her parents, along with most of her extended family, also lived there. She shared a particularly close bond with her mother. They confided in each other and were always in touch. From a young age, Roberta was known for her outgoing nature, kind heart, and cheerful personality. She excelled as a student and developed a deep passion for cooking, particularly showcasing her talent in baking pies and cakes. She was well liked by her peers and cherished spending time with her many friends. After completing public school, Roberta enrolled in Italy's School of Hospitality and Culinary Arts. At the age of 20, she began working at the most renowned bakery in her hometown, owned by the Lello family. Every family member participated in the bakery's operations, and Roberta became close friends with Fabio Di Lello, the younger son, who was her age and worked alongside her. Spending so much time together, their friendship quickly blossomed into a romantic relationship. Both families were very supportive of they. Roberta's parents took an immediate liking to Fabio, and Fabio's parents admired Roberta for her strong work ethic and sense of responsibility. By the age of 25, Roberta and Fabio had moved in together, sharing a rented apartment while saving money to buy their own home. Fabio, a passionate and dedicated soccer player since childhood, had achieved notable success. He served as the captain of the city's soccer team and performed impressively in amateur tournaments. In 2014, he made his debut in Serie D, the highest amateur soccer division under the Italian National League Federation. In 2015, Roberta and Fabio achieved a milestone in their lives. That autumn, they celebrated their wedding with a grand ceremony and moved into a spacious and cozy house of their own. They were overjoyed and excited about their future, making plans they were eager to fulfill, plans that would tragically never come to fruition. On the morning of Friday, July the 1st, 2016, Roberta, then 34, called her mother, as she did every day. She suggested having dinner that evening at her parents' house, intending to gather everyone there to share exciting news. Keeping the announcement a surprise, she planned to reveal it at dinner and agreed with her mother to prepare the meal and set the table together. Around 2 p.m., Roberta left her house on her scooter, heading to her parents' home, just a few kilometers away, a trip that usually took about 10 minutes. Tragically, Roberta never arrived. While passing through one of the busiest intersections in town and carefully obeying traffic rules, a Fiat Punto sped through a red light from the opposite lane and collided violently with her scooter. The car then crashed into another vehicle. The force of the impact threw Roberta into a metal pole and onto the sidewalk. She sustained a severe, traumatic brain injury, lost a significant amount of blood, and was barely alive by the time emergency services arrived. Paramedics were astonished that Roberta was still alive, given the extent of her injuries. She was rushed to the nearest hospital and immediately taken into surgery. Despite the efforts of the top surgeons, who worked tirelessly for nearly an hour, her injuries were simply too severe. Roberta passed away without regaining consciousness. The drivers of the other two vehicles involved in the crash suffered only minor injuries and did not require hospitalization. The driver of the Fiat Punto was identified as 21-year-old local resident Italo De Lisa. He remained at the scene visibly shaken and did not attempt to flee. He waited for the police to arrive, cooperated fully, and explained what had happened. He admitted he had briefly taken his eyes off the road and failed to notice the traffic light turning red. By the time he realized, it was too late to avoid the collision. After hitting Roberta's scooter, he panicked, swerved into oncoming traffic, and struck another car. He willingly handed over his documents and underwent a toxicology screening at the hospital, which confirmed that he was not under the influence of alcohol or any banned substances. Witnesses and officers noted his profound remorse. Upon learning later that Roberta had not survived, he was overcome with distress and nearly collapsed. Fabio was the first to hear the devastating news. He rushed to the hospital just minutes after his wife, Roberta, had been brought in. In the hallway, he broke down, crying and praying, desperately pleading for updates from every doctor and nurse who entered or left the operating room. About 30 minutes later, the surgeon came out and, after a pause, informed Fabio that they had done everything possible, but Roberta could not be saved. Fabio's reaction was heartbreaking. Stunned and in denial, he repeatedly begged to see Roberta, clinging to the hope that there had been some mistake. But the truth was inescapable. She had passed away. As the reality sunk in, Fabio was overtaken by grief and anger. Overwhelmed, he reportedly wanted to confront the person responsible immediately. Hospital staff had to physically restrain him and escort him to a private room where he was given a sedative to calm down. At the same time, Italo, the driver responsible for the crash, was deeply shaken, repeatedly saying he didn't deserve forgiveness. Meanwhile, Roberta's parents were growing anxious. Their daughter was overdue and not answering her phone. They began calling Fabio, who initially didn't pick up. When he finally answered, he tearfully broke the tragic news. Within 15 minutes, both Roberta's and Fabio's families gathered at the hospital, struggling to process the devastating loss. Their vibrant and joyful lives, filled with dreams and plans, had been shattered in an instant. Instead of celebrating Roberta and Fabio's upcoming anniversary, they were now faced with the unimaginable task of saying goodbye to her. Roberta was laid to rest on July 3, 2016, just 2 months before what would have been her and Fabio's first wedding anniversary. The farewell took place in the same church where they had recently pledged their love and commitment. The priest who officiated their wedding also led this deeply somber memorial service. The small church overflowed with mourners. So many people came that not everyone could fit inside. Roberta was beloved and well-respected in her community, and friends, neighbors, and colleagues gathered to honor her memory and support her grieving family. The tragedy left the entire town in shock. Few could believe she was truly gone. The man responsible for the fatal crash, Italo, did not flee the scene. He cooperated fully and underwent medical testing at the hospital. He was completely sober and had no history of mental illness or emotional instability. The crash happened at a busy intersection, equipped with multiple traffic cameras. The police reviewed footage from 4 different angles, clearly capturing the accident. Investigators also retrieved surveillance videos showing the routes both drivers took prior to the crash. The footage revealed that both vehicles had adhered to traffic laws and speed limits. However, at the crucial moment, Italo failed to stop at a red light. He drove through the intersection, colliding with the scooter Roberta was riding. After hitting Roberta, Italo's Fiat Punto struck another car coming from the opposite direction. Fortunately, the driver of the second car was not seriously injured, and his vehicle damage was covered by insurance, so he did not pursue legal action. Tragically, Roberta's injuries were far too severe to be treated. Italo expressed his deep regret, claiming he had been distracted for just a moment. Despite his regret, nothing could ease the pain of Roberta's loved ones, particularly Fabio, who struggled to suppress his anger toward the man responsible. The 21-year-old driver, Italo, was arrested and formally charged with involuntary harm, causing fatal injuries. He was placed in pre-trial detention while awaiting the court proceedings. He did not contest the charges, declaring that he was ready to accept any punishment imposed. Fabio closely followed every development in the investigation. He meticulously reviewed all available evidence and met with detectives daily in his search for answers and any additional leads. Fabio strongly rejected the official findings, convinced that Italo or his family had influenced the authorities to minimize his responsibility for the accident. Fabio believed the crash was caused by substance use and was determined to keep the case in the public eye. Fabio organized protests and marches, demanding full accountability from Italo for the fatal accident. Many people, especially those who had known Roberta, supported him. Fabio also launched an aggressive online campaign against Italo and his family, accusing him of intentional misconduct, banned substance use, and claiming that his relatives had bribed officials to tamper with the toxicology report. His social media posts, filled with accusations and cries for justice, appeared daily. On July 15, 2016, Fabio organized a memorial march for Roberta, attended by hundreds, carrying her photos and signs demanding justice. Fabio's rhetoric grew more intense, threatening further demonstrations and even suggesting, during emotional outbursts, that he might take matters into his own hands if the authorities failed to act. His increasingly confrontational tone stirred public outrage but also alarmed Italo's family, who began fearing for their safety. Fabio's hostility toward Italo was evident as he worked to sway public opinion against him. Fabio's actions hinted at a willingness to disregard the law to seek retribution. In response, Italo's family filed for a court order to protect themselves, citing Fabio's harassment and threats. The case remained under investigation with incomplete evidence, but the situation was becoming dangerously volatile and required urgent legal action. On July 20th, Fabio was issued a court order barring him from accusing Italo of a crime, inciting hatred, posting harmful content online, or encouraging hostility toward Italo or his family. Fabio complied, but abruptly withdrew from public advocacy, leaving others unsettled by his silence. Every day, Fabio visited the grave of his late wife, Roberta, bringing fresh flowers. He spent hours there, sometimes standing silently, other times kneeling, crying, or praying. His family, hoping he just needed time to grieve, chose not to intervene, but his behavior only escalated. Fabio erected a memorial at the accident site and turned Roberta's gravesite into a detailed tribute with photos from their happiest moments. He began spending entire days at the cemetery. He quit soccer, his lifelong passion, and stopped going to work. Nothing seemed to matter to Fabio anymore. His life revolved around the flower-covered grave. He ate little, lost significant weight, and looked pale and exhausted. Within weeks, he appeared drastically older, withdrawn from others. Fabio grew disconnected from reality. One morning, cemetery staff found Fabio at Roberta's grave before opening hours. He had climbed the fence overnight, saying he needed to be close to her. He told relatives he couldn't bear staying in their home, filled with memories of Roberta. Only at her gravesite did he feel any peace. Fabio spoke to her as though she was still alive, refusing to refer to her in the past tense. Fabio's older brother suggested a brief trip to Rome to help him clear his head, but Fabio refused, insisting he couldn't leave Roberta alone in the cemetery. This was a clear sign that Fabio needed more than the support of loved ones. He required urgent professional psychiatric care. Fabio's brother and other family members dismissed his concerning words and erratic behavior, believing time would heal him. Unfortunately, they were tragically wrong. Meanwhile, the parents of Italo, who was still in custody, hired a top attorney to defend their son. The lawyer was confident from the start, highlighting that Italo had no prior criminal record, rarely broke traffic laws, and tested sober at the time of the incident. While the attorney admitted that running a red light was a mistake, He argued there was no evidence to support serious charges, such as premeditated intent. He also pointed out that Italo had followed the speed limit throughout his drive, and it remained unclear what had distracted him. To support their case, the defense presented character testimonials from Italo's school and workplace, as well as evidence of his volunteer work in environmental causes and his enrollment in firefighter training courses. Italo had planned to dedicate himself to public service after finishing his certification exams. During the trial, the defense submitted surveillance footage showing Roberta on her scooter without a helmet, which violated safety regulations. The attorney argued that wearing a helmet could have lessened the severity of her injuries and perhaps even saved her life. Considering this footage, Italo's clean record, and Roberta's safety oversight, the court modified his pre-trial conditions. He was released under judicial supervision shortly before Christmas 2016, with the final decision scheduled for February 2017. Other than a few restrictions, Italo resumed a normal life. When Fabio learned that the man responsible for the accident had been released, he was consumed by rage. In court, he shouted and tried to physically confront Italo and Italo's attorney. Family members struggled to hold him back, and the judge ordered him to be removed from the courtroom. After Italo's release, Fabio became sleepless, angry, and withdrawn. He spent countless hours by Roberta's grave, talking to her as if she was still alive. Despite Fabio's worsening mental state, his family did not seek professional help. They thought he just needed more time to heal. When they suggested seeing a mental health specialist, Fabio reacted with hostility. He began accusing the justice system of being corrupt and incapable of delivering a fair outcome. When Italo was allowed to await trial out of custody, Fabio completely lost faith in the law. He decided to take matters into his own hands, but didn't reveal his plans to anyone. His behavior shifted noticeably. He became increasingly secretive and withdrawn. Fabio had an interest in firearms dating back to his youth. He regularly visited shooting ranges and, in 2006, obtained a firearm license, purchasing a 9mm pistol that he kept secured in a safe at home. Now consumed by thoughts of vengeance, he started handling the weapon often, convinced that it was his only means of achieving justice. As New Year's approached, Fabio's social media activity took a dark turn. He began posting about justice, revenge, and reflections on life's meaning, lamenting how his own life had lost purpose. These posts were deeply troubling, but sadly, they went unnoticed. In January, Fabio began secretly following Italo to avoid drawing attention. Fabio observed his daily routines, the places he visited, and the people he interacted with. Using this information, Fabio devised a plan. On February 1, 2017, he took a loaded pistol and went to a bar on Via Perth, a location Italo frequented and close to his home. Fabio entered the bar to confirm Italo was there. After spotting him, he left quietly and found a discreet location nearby to wait. Around 9:30 p.m., Italo exited the bar, chatted briefly with friends, and was about to head home. At that moment, Fabio confronted him. Italo sensed something was wrong, and both men froze briefly. Then Fabio pulled out his pistol and fired 3 shots at close range. The first shot struck Italo in the abdomen, the second near his heart, and the third, a headshot, ensured there was no chance of survival. Fabio, an experienced marksman, executed the act with precision, leaving no room for error. Afterward, Fabio walked calmly to his car. Witnesses, shocked by what they had seen, were too afraid to intervene, knowing he likely wouldn't hesitate to use the weapon again. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but Italo was pronounced dead at the scene. Police interviewed witnesses and were able to identify Fabio as the perpetrator. When officers went to his house, he wasn't there. Fabio's family, upon learning what happened, informed police of where he was likely headed. Authorities intercepted him on his way to the cemetery. Fabio had planned to end his life at Roberta's grave after what he believed was an act of justice over her death. However, police arrived before he could carry out the plan. He didn't resist arrest, showed no emotion, and openly admitted to the crime. At the police station, Fabio broke down. he spoke of his intense love for his wife, Roberta, and his anger with the justice system for allowing Italo to walk free after the car accident that killed her. Then he revealed an even deeper motive. Roberta had been pregnant. Though it was still early in the pregnancy, they had discovered the news just one day before the fatal crash. Roberta had planned to surprise their families with the announcement during dinner, a moment that never came. The accident had taken both her and their unborn child. Fabio said his actions were retaliation for the loss of not just his wife, but also the future they were building. He expressed that he had nothing left to live for, wanting only to reunite with his family. After his arrest, Fabio was sent for psychiatric evaluation. Doctors diagnosed him with acute psychological trauma caused by profound grief. However, the court determined that Fabio had acted deliberately and with full awareness of his actions. He was charged with first-degree premeditated murder. While awaiting trial, Fabio made several attempts to harm himself and was placed under strict supervision. On March 24, 2017, he was found guilty and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Fabio showed no emotion during the verdict, appearing detached from the moment. His family and legal team appealed the sentence, which was later reduced to 20 years. In prison, Fabio reportedly turned to religion for some solace, but never fully recovered from the loss of his wife and unborn child. Anthony Pignataro was born in 1960 in Buffalo, New York, the youngest of two brothers. His father, Ralph Pignataro, was a well-known and highly respected surgeon in the community. After finishing high school, he decided to follow in his father's footsteps and applied to several medical schools in the U.S. However, due to his low grades, he was not admitted to any of them. Eventually, he gained acceptance to a medical school in Puerto Rico, where he began his journey toward becoming a doctor. In 1978, 18 years old, Anthony met 21-year-old Deborah at a club during a visit to his hometown. It was love at first sight. Anthony, tall and charming, swept Deborah off her feet as they danced to Donna Summer's Last Dance. Soon after meeting, they began a relationship. Despite their long-distance relationship, while Anthony studied in Puerto Rico and Deborah worked in New York, their love affair continued. Deborah was born and raised in Williamsville, New York, in a financially struggling family. She worked as a pharmacy assistant. In 1985, after graduating as an ENT doctor from medical school in Puerto Rico, Anthony returned to New York, obtained a medical license, and started working as a surgeon at a local hospital. However, his colleagues criticized his skills, calling him incompetent and predicting an unremarkable career. Despite this, he managed to keep his job. That same year, Anthony and Deborah got married. Early in their marriage, Deborah discovered through a friend that Anthony was having an affair. When she confided in her father, he advised her to forgive Anthony, but only once. Deborah decided to give him another chance. Not long after, they welcomed a son, and a year later, a daughter. They moved into a large home in suburban Buffalo, where Anthony started his own surgical practice. He rented office space in a private clinic and began seeing patients. By 1990, 30 years old, Anthony gained attention for inventing a wig prosthesis that was attached to the scalp using metal pins implanted in the skull. He became his own first client, as he had begun losing his hair at the age of 23. This wig became his patented invention. With prices starting at $3,500, clients could choose from a variety of natural and synthetic hair options. This invention contributed to his local fame. Anthony also performed cosmetic surgeries, such as breast augmentations, facelifts, rhinoplasties, liposuctions, and more. His services were competitively priced, and he often ran promotions to attract clients. Over the next 7 years, Anthony became wealthy and locally renowned, even driving a red Lamborghini. However, his reputation concealed the troubling events that were occurring in his operating room. In 1997, Terry Lamarty, a mother of 4, struggled to lose excess belly fat despite regular exercise. On her 39th birthday, her husband gave her a voucher for a belly liposuction treatment at Anthony's clinic. Excited, she scheduled a consultation with Anthony. During their meeting, she was impressed by his charisma and reassurances, which put her at ease. Anthony assured her that the procedure would go smoothly. Terry began preparing for the operation, undergoing necessary medical tests, consulting specialists, and completing the required paperwork. The surgery was scheduled for June 1997. On the day of her scheduled procedure, at 8:30 a.m., Terry's husband drove her to the clinic. Upon arrival, she went to see Anthony to be examined and given medication to prepare for the surgery. He then wheeled her into the clinic's basement, referred to as the surgical center. To Terry's shock, the room looked nothing like a sterile operating theater. It was just an ordinary basement furnished with a couch, a table, and chairs. She didn't see any proper surgical equipment. Feeling uneasy, she tried to express her desire to cancel the operation, but she was already under the effects of the medication. Her speech slurred, and she lost control of her body. Before passing out, she helplessly screamed. Terry regained consciousness at 5 p.m., fully clothed and sitting on a small sofa in the clinic's first-floor waiting room. Her husband arrived shortly after and took her home. Once home, Terry noticed blood running down her legs. Panicked, she examined herself and found a roughly 10 centimeter long and 2 centimeter deep surgical incision on her stomach, poorly closed with about 20 metal staples. Alarmed, she and her husband immediately called Anthony over the phone. He dismissed their concerns, claiming the blood was excess surgical fluid and telling them not to worry. He assured them the wound was minor and advised Terry to rest and visit him the next morning. That night, Terry's pain became unbearable, worsening by the hour. She also experienced severe nausea and vomiting. By morning, she couldn't endure it anymore and called for an ambulance. At the hospital, doctors discovered that Anthony's stitches were blocking blood flow to her abdomen, causing some tissue to necrotize. On top of that, her intestines had been damaged during the procedure, leading to an infection in the wound. Instead of achieving her desired appearance, Terry was now fighting for her life. Fortunately, she received help in time and survived. A few days later, at 2:30 just while Terry was still recovering in the hospital, she was startled awake by Anthony. He had secretly entered her room and was holding her medical records. He demanded that she immediately pack her belongings and leave the hospital. Terrified, Terry refused and argued with him. Hospital nurses overheard the confrontation, and Anthony was forced to leave. After this alarming encounter, Terry remained in the hospital for several more days. Her recovery stretched on for months, and despite doctors reporting the incident to the State Department of Health, Anthony continued practicing medicine. 2 months later, in August 1997, a more tragic event occurred at Anthony's clinic. 26-year-old Sarah Smith, a mother of 2, underwent breast implant surgery, a procedure she had long dreamed of. During the operation, Sarah suffered cardiac arrest. Anthony called an ambulance, but when paramedics arrived, they found him trying to clear Sarah's airway using a wire hanger. The clinic lacked even basic life-saving medical equipment, like a ventilation device. Paramedics resuscitated Sarah on site and transported her to the hospital, but she had already fallen into a coma. After a week in intensive care, Sarah passed away on September 1, 1997. News of Sarah's death quickly spread, sparking a media frenzy. Anthony admitted that Sarah had stopped breathing during the surgery. He said he performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation and injected her with lidocaine, but it was ineffective. Ultimately, he instructed his assistants to call for an ambulance. An investigation by the Herald Police Department revealed that Sarah's death was caused by asphyxia due to severely low oxygen levels, which led to cardiac arrest. A toxicology report further showed that Anthony had administered a dangerously high dose of 2 muscle-relaxing drugs during the procedure, leaving Sarah unable to breathe on her own. After Sarah's death, the New York State Department of Health suspended Anthony Pignataro's medical license. Shortly thereafter, the Erie County District Attorney's Office in New York launched an investigation. Anthony, who had an inflated self-image, had opened his own plastic surgery clinic but failed to hire an anesthesiologist or adequately trained staff. Instead, his wife, Deborah, assisted him despite having only 6 months of medical training. Additionally, a young female medical student interned at the clinic. During Sarah's procedure, both Deborah and the intern reported that Sarah woke up mid-surgery, screaming. In response, Anthony administered additional drugs, causing Sarah to lose consciousness once again. Deborah noticed that Sarah's oxygen levels had dropped to a dangerously low level and alerted Anthony, but he ignored her and continued the operation. Shortly after, Sarah's lips turned blue. She stopped breathing, and her heart eventually stopped. Investigators interviewed Anthony's colleagues and patients, uncovering a reputation for gross incompetence and recklessness. Many of his patients had suffered complications following surgeries. For instance, 78 years old, Sophie Butring underwent a tummy tuck performed by Anthony. She became ill after the procedure, but was hesitant to seek medical attention. Her son eventually convinced her to go to the hospital, which saved her life. She spent 6 weeks in the hospital, recovering from complications caused by the surgery. The New York State Board of Health eventually filed 30 charges of professional misconduct against Anthony. Investigators discovered that he was not licensed to perform plastic surgery and that his basement clinic was grossly unfit for medical procedures. In January 1998, Anthony, then 38 years old, was arrested. By August of that year, his medical license was permanently revoked. Anthony ultimately accepted a plea deal on a negligent homicide charge and was sentenced to 6 months in prison, fined $5,000, and ordered to complete 250 hours of community service. He was also permanently banned from practicing medicine. As the verdict was announced, the judge ordered Anthony to be taken into custody immediately. Deborah, who was visibly upset in the courtroom, was not allowed to say goodbye to her husband. However, if Deborah had known what lay ahead, she likely would not have shed any tears. In December 1998, Anthony was released from jail. He returned home to live with his wife and children, but struggled to find work. During this time, his mother provided financial support. Despite the challenges, he resumed an extramarital affair, which his wife, Deborah, eventually discovered. Furious, she kicked him out of the house. 2 months later, he returned, begging for a second chance, and she reluctantly took him back. By May 1999, Deborah, then 42 years old, suddenly fell gravely ill. She suffered episodes of nausea and body pain, which gradually worsened to include tingling in her arms and legs, difficulty walking, and extended periods confined to bed. Although Deborah sought medical help, doctors were initially unable to determine the cause of her symptoms. Over the following months, her condition continued to deteriorate. By the summer of 1999, she required a wheelchair and began experiencing memory loss. Anthony claimed her symptoms were caused by a diseased gallbladder, which he insisted needed urgent removal. However, Deborah's physician warned that surgery would be too dangerous and could result in her death. Eventually, toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of arsenic in Deborah's blood. A criminal investigation into Deborah's poisoning was launched. Tests conducted on her hair showed that she had been exposed to approximately 30 grams of arsenic in varying doses since May. During questioning, Deborah recalled that her symptoms began after eating soup Anthony had prepared for her. Investigators suspected Anthony had been poisoning her over time. Deborah granted police permission to search their home, where they discovered ant killer containing arsenic. Further evidence revealed that Anthony had purchased the poison using his credit card. He was subsequently brought in for questioning. Anthony admitted to poisoning Deborah, but suggested that the relatives of his deceased patient, Sarah, who passed away after surgery, might have been involved. Due to insufficient evidence, Anthony was released. Deborah was discharged from the hospital, though she remained in a wheelchair and needed ongoing treatment at home. Later, a former cellmate of Anthony's, who had shared a prison cell with him, contacted the police. The cellmate revealed that Anthony had discussed his wife, Deborah's life insurance policy, and his relationship with his mistress. According to the cellmate, Anthony confessed he wanted to start a new life with his mistress and obtain the insurance payout. He had even asked the cellmate for advice on poisoning someone. Recorded phone conversations confirmed that Anthony maintained contact with the cellmate after his release from prison. With this evidence, Anthony was arrested on May 9, 2000 for attempted murder. While he initially denied poisoning Deborah, he eventually pleaded guilty at the end of 2000. Prosecutors proved that Anthony had been adding small doses of poison to Deborah's food and planning to send her for gallbladder surgery, hoping she would die during the procedure. His motive was to prove he wasn't the only doctor to lose a patient on the operating table, reclaim his reputation, and regain financial success. He also sought to justify Sarah's death. Anthony Pignataro was sentenced to 12 years in prison. While incarcerated, he continued to file lawsuits, claiming that Deborah intentionally consumed arsenic to end her life. However, Deborah refuted this in interviews, stating she would never harm herself and even suggested Anthony should experience arsenic poisoning. Following the trial, she divorced Anthony and obtained a protective order prohibiting him from contacting her or their children. Deborah endured a lengthy recovery process after the poisoning. She revealed in interviews that she suffered lasting health issues, including reduced limb mobility and sensitivity, and required outside assistance for daily life. In December 2013, Anthony was released from prison and moved back to New York, where he worked as a grocery delivery man. He legally changed his name to Tony Hote in 2014, explaining that he wanted a fresh start. By 2016, he launched a cosmetic company and falsely portrayed himself as a practicing doctor on the business website. He marketed a product called the Plasma Protocol, claiming it was the first anti-aging skincare treatment derived from a person's DNA plasma. The company operated near his previous plastic surgery clinic. Neighbors began reporting suspicious activities at Anthony's residence, including deliveries of surgical supplies and frequent visits from women in the evenings. These reports prompted police attention, leading Anthony to shut down his business and move to Palm Beach, Florida, where his brother lived. New York police warned law enforcement in Palm Beach about Anthony, describing him as one of the most dangerous people they had ever encountered. By 2019, Anthony was advertising elder care services online and continued to move freely across the country. Florida authorities monitored him, but there remained concerns about whether he posed a risk to others. As for Deborah, she maintained a private life and struggled with the lasting impact of Anthony's actions, unable to fully recover her health or independence. A mother of two disappeared mysteriously, she sending alarming messages to her family before she vanished. Police began investigating immediately, trying to understand conflicting information. However, the investigation took an unexpected turn, revealing a shocking story that would captivate the nation. Katie Kenyon was born in Burnley, a small town in Britain. She had two very close sisters. Even as a child, Katie was known for her kindness and generosity, always willing to help others. Later, she married and had two children, a son and a daughter. Sadly, her husband left, and although he occasionally visited the children, Katie raised them on her own. It was difficult, as her job as a social care worker didn't pay much, but Katie always made sure her children had everything they needed. On April 22, 2022, 33-year-old Katie followed her normal morning routine, preparing her children for school and sending them off. Later that day, around noon, Katie's mother received a strange text message from her. Katie stated she needed to get away for a while to clear her head. Her mother immediately tried calling her, but the call went directly to voicemail. The idea that she would abandon everything, especially her children, seemed completely out of character. Katie's mother contacted Katie's sister, Sarah Kenyon Holden. They rushed over to her house and noticed that her car was gone. Using a spare key, they let themselves inside and found all of Katie's belongings right where she'd left them, except for her phone and handbag. It just didn't add up. The idea that Katie had taken off somewhere, leaving behind almost everything she owned, felt completely wrong. Something was off. Soon after, Katie's children arrived home from school and shared something concerning. They had both received odd text messages, supposedly from their mother. In the texts, Katie stated she needed help to become a better mother and instructed them to contact their father to care for them during her absence. Upon reading these messages, Sarah immediately suspected they weren't written by her. Firstly, the tone was unlike Katie's usual way of speaking. More significantly, the word "while" was misspelled in both texts, which was highly unusual for Katie, as she never made such errors. Katie had mentioned Andrew Burfield, Katie's ex-boyfriend of several years, in messages to her children, saying he would care for them if their father couldn't. Sarah contacted Andrew. He told her he hadn't seen Katie since the previous day because he'd been at work. He stated that Katie texted him around 2 p.m. that day, informing him that she was leaving her car, keys, and bank card in his mailbox. Andrew claimed this was to repay the £6,000 she owed him for past anxiety treatment. However, Sarah completely disbelieved Andrew's account. Katie's son then mentioned that Andrew had contacted him on social media. Andrew's message stated that Katie had checked into a clinic and asked him to care for her dog until she returned. This struck Katie's mother and Sarah as odd. While they knew Katie and Andrew had a long, turbulent relationship, they believed it was over. Therefore, it seemed strange that Katie would inform Andrew of her plans while neglecting to tell her own mother or children. So, Sarah and her boyfriend decided to drive over to Andrew's place and investigate. The moment they pulled up, she spotted Katie's car parked outside. Inside, she could see Katie's purse and other personal belongings, which only heightened her suspicion. She knocked on Andrew's door, hoping to talk to him face to face, but he refused to open it and told them to leave. The whole thing felt incredibly off. Sarah didn't understand why Andrew seemed so uncooperative. Her boyfriend ended up threatening to kick the door down if he didn't let them in, but Andrew just called the police instead. A few minutes later, officers arrived and spoke with Katie's sister first. She laid everything out, how the family was worried sick, and how they didn't believe for a second that Katie would just vanish without saying a word to anyone. She also pointed out her sister's car still parked there with her stuff inside. After that, the police knocked on Andrew's door. He gave them the same story he told over the phone, that he'd been at work when Katie texted him about leaving her car, keys, and bank card, and said she was going to check herself into a clinic. He even let them search his house and his van, and they didn't find anything suspicious. So, the police left, but they did open a missing persons case. Just to cover all bases, they called around to a bunch of clinics, hoping maybe Katie really had checked herself in somewhere, but not a single one had seen her. The next morning, police began piecing together a timeline of Katie's disappearance. And naturally, all eyes were on Andrew's house, since that's where her car had been found. Detectives learned there was a surveillance camera nearby, so they pulled the footage from the previous couple of days. On April 21st, the day before Katie went missing, she was seen pulling up to Andrew's house. The footage showed her getting into his van, kissing him and smiling. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the next morning, at 9:20 a.m., things took a very different turn. That was the day Andrew told police he'd been at work when Katie supposedly dropped off her car, but the footage showed otherwise. It clearly showed Katie arriving at his house, getting out of her car, and climbing into the passenger seat of Andrew's van. And right there behind the wheel was Andrew himself. Police immediately checked traffic cameras along the direction the van had gone. This time, the van stopped at a McDonald's, then headed out toward the highway. The final footage showed Andrew turning onto a rural back road leading into a wooded area. After that, the van disappeared from view for nearly an hour, but then it popped up again. This time, though, there was only one person in the vehicle. So, now, a much darker picture was starting to form. Based on the footage, it looked like Andrew had driven Katie out to a wooded area and then left without her. The police pulled location data from Katie's phone on the day she went missing. The record showed that her phone disconnected from the tower near her house early that morning, then reconnected near Andrew's home. From there, the phone's path followed the exact route the van had taken. According to the location data, Katie's phone was still in the van as it headed back towards Andrew's place. The problem was Katie was no longer in the van. And then came the final piece. Investigators checked the time those strange messages were sent to Katie's mom and kids. And by that point, Andrew had already returned home alone. But location data clearly showed that those texts were sent from his house. Given that all the evidence directly contradicted Andrew's version of events, police decided to head back to his house. The moment they stepped inside, something felt off. The place was boiling hot. Turns out Andrew had fired up the wood, burning stove, despite the weather being pretty mild outside. Right away, detectives suspected he might have been trying to destroy some evidence, but by the time they got there, all that was left in the stove was ash. Even so, they arrested Andrew and brought him in for questioning. Surprisingly, he didn't seem nervous at all. In fact, he looked completely relaxed and stuck to his original story, claiming Katie had probably checked herself into a clinic to deal with her anxiety. When detectives started pressing for more answers, he shut down completely and said he wouldn't talk without a lawyer. So, once again, they were left with nothing. After the interrogation, police decided to launch a large-scale search operation in the forest, where Katie's phone had last pinged right before Andrew was seen driving back alone. Covering that area, however, wasn't an easy task. They were looking at roughly 25 miles of rugged terrain. Still, they pulled in dozens of officers, requested backup from other agencies, and headed out into the woods. Soon they had helicopters with thermal imaging, drones, specialized equipment, and even a team of divers. Volunteers joined in too. The search quickly became one of the biggest operations their town had ever seen. But even with all that manpower, it still wasn't enough to cover such a huge area. Then, out of nowhere, police got a tip. Someone had seen Andrew's van parked in a specific part of the forest. That changed everything. Now that they had a likely spot, they were able to narrow the search down to a 5-mile radius. As the search teams combed through the forest, detectives brought Andrew in for another round of questioning. This time, they laid out the surveillance footage and other evidence they had gathered. Faced with the facts, Andrew changed his story. He admitted that he and Katie had driven out to the woods, but what he said next left investigators baffled. According to Andrew, the two of them went there to have a picnic. He claimed Katie had a habit of writing down her thoughts in a journal and then burning the pages as a way to let go of things that were bothering her. He insisted that morning had been no different. They had a picnic, lit a small fire. She burned a few pages, and then he drove home. He said he didn't know what happened to Katie after that. Of course, detectives didn't buy Andrew's story, but the problem was they still didn't have any solid leads. The search teams had come up empty, and with no trace of Katie in the woods, investigators shifted their focus to her relationship with Andrew. According to Katie's family, she had met him 3 years earlier. He had 2 kids from a previous marriage, worked in construction, and at first he seemed like a reliable, stable guy. But it didn't take long for her loved ones to notice cracks in the relationship. Andrew had a habit of trying to control Katie, telling her how to act, how to talk, even how to think. He also constantly brought up her anxiety, using it as a way to dismiss anything she said or did that he didn't like. And over time, that pressure only made her anxiety worse. Eventually, Andrew offered to pay for her treatment, and Katie agreed. But as time went on, things just kept getting worse. The fights became more frequent, more intense. Eventually, the relationship fell apart. For Katie, breaking up felt like a weight off her shoulders, but for Andrew, it was something he just couldn't accept. Not long after they split, Katie discovered someone had slashed the tires on her car. She was certain it was Andrew, but she never reported it to the police. A few months before, Katie went missing. She got a letter from the court saying she owed Andrew £4,000, the amount he'd spent on her treatment. Katie was already struggling to cover basic expenses for her and her kids. She had no idea how she'd come up with that kind of money. Over time, late fees piled on, and the debt grew to £6,000. The whole situation sent her anxiety through the roof. She was terrified she'd lose her home, the only stable place her kids had. But more than anything, she was afraid of Andrew. In one message to her mom, Katie said she was scared of him and genuinely believed he might hurt her. Still, just a month before she disappeared, Andrew reached out to her. He told her he regretted ever taking her to court. He promised to drop the case and even said he'd pay all the extra fees that had built up since the ruling. Andrew apologized for his anger, told her he wanted to change, and eventually Katie forgave him. Despite everything, they got back together. Still, detectives found something even more disturbing. Just one day after Andrew promised to fix everything with the court, he actually called the debt collectors and told them to go harder on Katie. He wanted them to push her even more. Investigators believe this was all part of his plan to increase the pressure on her, making her even more dependent on him. Katie, of course, had no idea this was happening because Andrew kept telling her he was working on canceling the whole thing. This gave detectives an even darker picture of the situation. All the evidence pointed to one conclusion: Andrew was a skilled manipulator and a compulsive liar who would do anything to get his way. Soon, detectives received further confirmation of this theory. People who knew him corroborated this, telling investigators that Andrew had a knack for getting inside people's heads and controlling them, something he had been doing for years, even with those closest to him. Despite all this, police still had no clue where Katie was. The search dragged on, day after day, without a trace. But then, finally, investigators caught a break. A local man came forward with a strange story. He said that the morning after Katie went missing, Andrew randomly showed up at his house. They were strangers, but Andrew approached him and asked a bizarre question. "Do you know when your bins were last emptied?" This immediately raised red flags. Officers rushed to the man's property and discovered that the trash bins hadn't been collected in several days. They started digging through the garbage, and inside one of the bags, they found something chilling: sandals stained with blood. A DNA test confirmed the blood was Katie's. At that point, detectives were certain of one thing: Katie was dead, and Andrew was officially charged with her murder. But a huge problem remained. They had no idea where her body was. Shortly after being formally charged, Andrew told detectives he wanted to talk. He changed his story yet again. This time, Andrew claimed he and Katie had gone to the woods that morning for a picnic. While sitting by a fire, Katie supposedly spotted a hatchet he'd used to chop wood and jokingly dared him to throw it at a soda can she was holding a few feet away. Andrew said he accepted the dare, but as he threw the hatchet, Katie suddenly leaned forward, and it struck her in the back of the head. Of course, detectives didn't believe a word of it, but this time, Andrew at least admitted the location of her body. He claimed that when Katie collapsed and died, he panicked. There was no cell service in that part of the forest, and he said he didn't have the strength to carry her back to the van. So, he decided to bury her there to prevent animals from getting to her body. He said he dug a shallow grave, placed Katie's body inside, and covered it with leaves and branches, marking the spot by tying a plastic bag to a stick, planning to return later. He also admitted to burning Katie's phone and some of her other belongings in his fireplace, then scooping up the charred remains and dumping them in a trash bin somewhere around town. After speaking with Andrew, police returned to his house, hoping to uncover new evidence. This time, forensic experts managed to find traces of Katie's blood inside his washing machine. Meanwhile, the search for Katie's body continued. Investigators focused on locating the stick with the plastic bag Andrew claimed he'd used to mark the burial site. But even with that clue, search teams couldn't find the exact spot. While the search was underway, detectives uncovered something else. After investigating Andrew's online activity, they found that he'd been communicating with numerous women on various dating sites, flirting with practically anyone who responded. He'd even been seeing at least one woman in person. According to their conversations, Andrew had told her he owned multiple properties across the country. They were even discussing moving to Scotland together and buying a house. But that wasn't the most significant discovery. As they continued examining his phone, investigators discovered something that changed everything. Based on Jeep's data, the day before Katie vanished, Andrew had stopped by his parents' house, then turned off his phone for about an hour and a half. During that time, his van was captured on several surveillance cameras heading toward the woods. After speaking to Andrew's parents, police learned that the morning before Katie went missing, he'd borrowed a shovel. That's when it clicked. Andrew had likely gone to the woods that day to dig her grave in advance. The next day, after killing Katie and using her phone to message her kids and family, Andrew also texted his other girlfriend using his own phone, telling her that something had come up with his kids and that he'd have to cancel their date. But there was more. In the Notes app on his phone, investigators found something even more disturbing: drafts of the exact same messages he'd sent to Katie's children and mother. Digital forensics showed that he'd been editing those drafts over several weeks, tweaking them repeatedly to match Katie's writing style so no one would suspect anything. Most tellingly, the word "while" was misspelled in the exact same way it appeared in the final messages. It's also important to note that the note had been created over a month before the murder, proving one thing beyond any doubt: Andrew didn't just snap. He'd been planning this for weeks, perhaps even longer, carefully laying the groundwork for something he knew he was going to do. When police confronted Andrew with the evidence that he'd been in the woods the day before the murder, he claimed he had only gone there to walk his dog, not to dig a grave. Soon after, search teams finally found the stick and the plastic bag Andrew had mentioned, but there was no grave anywhere nearby. They scoured the area inch by inch, but came up empty-handed. On April 29th, the detectives brought Andrew out to the woods and asked him to show them exactly where he had buried Katie. Once they arrived, Andrew pointed to a specific patch of ground. The ground looked completely undisturbed, flat, smooth, and totally natural. There were no signs of digging, no shifted soil, nothing out of place. It had been concealed so well that officers later admitted they would never have found it without Andrew's help. As soon as the forensic team began digging, they found Katie. But what they uncovered next was unexpected. Andrew had somehow managed to bury her beneath a web of tree roots growing deep underground. Later, a geology expert explained the complexity of the grave. According to him, it would have taken hours to dig something like that, meaning Andrew had clearly come back more than once. The expert also pointed out that Andrew had separated the soil by layers, then buried them back in the correct order, which explained why the grave looked so untouched. That level of planning was chilling. Katie's body was handed over to forensic examiners. Immediately, Andrew's story about the Coke can and the axe throw fell apart. Katie had died from blows to the head with a hatchet, not just one or two, but 12 times. By that point, there was no doubt in the detectives' minds. This wasn't an accident. This was cold, calculated, and premeditated murder. With all of that evidence, the prosecution began preparing for trial. The case against Andrew was overwhelming, more than enough to secure a conviction. But one thing remained unclear: the motive. Investigators believed Andrew was fueled by bitterness and resentment. Katie had broken up with him months earlier, and it seemed his ego couldn't handle the rejection. That bruised pride, they believed, turned into hatred and ultimately led him to kill her. The trial began in November 2022, and at first, Andrew pleaded not guilty. But just 3 days in, he suddenly changed course. Out of nowhere, he reversed his plea and admitted to the murder. Unfortunately for Katie's family, he didn't offer any new details. He simply accepted responsibility, but it was still enough. In the end, the court sentenced Andrew Burfield to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 32 years, calling him a deeply dangerous individual. The case was officially closed. Anthony Pignataro was born in 1960 in Buffalo, New York, the youngest of 2 brothers. His father, Ralph Pignataro, was a well-known and highly respected surgeon in the community. After finishing high school, he decided to follow in his father's footsteps and applied to several medical schools in the US. However, due to his low grades, he was not admitted to any of them. Eventually, he gained acceptance to a medical school in Puerto Rico, where he began his journey toward becoming a doctor. In 1978, 18 years old, Anthony met 21 years old Deborah at a club during a visit to his hometown. It was love at first sight. Anthony, tall and charming, swept Deborah off her feet as they danced to Donna Summer's Last Dance. Soon after meeting, they began a relationship. Despite their long-distance relationship, while Anthony studied in Puerto Rico and Deborah worked in New York, their love affair continued. Deborah was born and raised in Williamsville, New York, in a financially struggling family. She worked as a pharmacy assistant. In 1985, after graduating as an ENT doctor from medical school in Puerto Rico, Anthony returned to New York, obtained a medical license, and started working as a surgeon at a local hospital. However, his colleagues criticized his skills, calling him incompetent and predicting an unremarkable career. Despite this, he managed to keep his job. That same year, Anthony and Deborah got married. Early in their marriage, Deborah discovered through a friend that Anthony was having an affair. When she confided in her father, he advised her to forgive Anthony, but only once. Deborah decided to give him another chance. Not long after, they welcomed a son, and a year later, a daughter. They moved into a large home in suburban Buffalo, where Anthony started his own surgical practice. He rented office space in a private clinic and began seeing patients. By 1990, 30 years old, Anthony gained attention for inventing a wig prosthesis that was attached to the scalp using metal pins implanted in the skull. He became his own first client, as he had begun losing his hair at the age of 23. This wig became his patented invention. With prices starting at $3,500, clients could choose from a variety of natural and synthetic hair options. This invention contributed to his local fame. Anthony also performed cosmetic surgeries, such as breast augmentations, facelifts, rhinoplasties, liposuctions, and more. His services were competitively priced, and he often ran promotions to attract clients. Over the next 7 years, Anthony became wealthy and locally renowned, even driving a red Lamborghini. However, his reputation concealed the troubling events that were occurring in his operating room. In 1997, Terry Lamarty, a mother of 4, struggled to lose excess belly fat despite regular exercise. On her 39th birthday, her husband gave her a voucher for a belly liposuction treatment at Anthony's clinic. Excited, she scheduled a consultation with Anthony. During their meeting, she was impressed by his charisma and reassurances, which put her at ease. Anthony assured her that the procedure would go smoothly. Terry began preparing for the operation, undergoing necessary medical tests, consulting specialists, and completing the required paperwork. The surgery was scheduled for June 1997. On the day of her scheduled procedure, at 8:30 a.m., Terry's husband drove her to the clinic. Upon arrival, she went to see Anthony to be examined and given medication to prepare for the surgery. He then wheeled her into the clinic's basement, referred to as the surgical center. To Terry's shock, the room looked nothing like a sterile operating theater. It was just an ordinary basement furnished with a couch, a table, and chairs. She didn't see any proper surgical equipment. Feeling uneasy, she tried to express her desire to cancel the operation, but she was already under the effects of the medication. Her speech slurred, and she lost control of her body. Before passing out, she helplessly screamed. Terry regained consciousness at 5 p.m., fully clothed and sitting on a small sofa in the clinic's first-floor waiting room. Her husband arrived shortly after and took her home. Once home, Terry noticed blood running down her legs. Panicked, she examined herself and found a roughly 10 centimeter long and 2 centimeter deep surgical incision on her stomach, poorly closed with about 20 metal staples. Alarmed, she and her husband immediately called Anthony over the phone. He dismissed their concerns, claiming the blood was excess surgical fluid and telling them not to worry. He assured them the wound was minor and advised Terry to rest and visit him the next morning. That night, Terry's pain became unbearable, worsening by the hour. She also experienced severe nausea and vomiting. By morning, she couldn't endure it anymore and called for an ambulance. At the hospital, doctors discovered that Anthony's stitches were blocking blood flow to her abdomen, causing some tissue to necrotize. On top of that, her intestines had been damaged during the procedure, leading to an infection in the wound. Instead of achieving her desired appearance, Terry was now fighting for her life. Fortunately, she received help in time and survived. A few days later, at 2:30 just while Terry was still recovering in the hospital, she was startled awake by Anthony. He had secretly entered her room and was holding her medical records. He demanded that she immediately pack her belongings and leave the hospital. Terrified, Terry refused and argued with him. Hospital nurses overheard the confrontation, and Anthony was forced to leave. After this alarming encounter, Terry remained in the hospital for several more days. Her recovery stretched on for months, and despite doctors reporting the incident to the State Department of Health, Anthony continued practicing medicine. 2 months later, in August 1997, a more tragic event occurred at Anthony's clinic. 26-year-old Sarah Smith, a mother of 2, underwent breast implant surgery, a procedure she had long dreamed of. During the operation, Sarah suffered cardiac arrest. Anthony called an ambulance, but when paramedics arrived, they found him trying to clear Sarah's airway using a wire hanger. The clinic lacked even basic life-saving medical equipment, like a ventilation device. Paramedics resuscitated Sarah on site and transported her to the hospital, but she had already fallen into a coma. After a week in intensive care, Sarah passed away on September 1, 1997. News of Sarah's death quickly spread, sparking a media frenzy. Anthony admitted that Sarah had stopped breathing during the surgery. He said he performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation and injected her with lidocaine, but it was ineffective. Ultimately, he instructed his assistants to call for an ambulance. An investigation by the Herald Police Department revealed that Sarah's death was caused by asphyxia due to severely low oxygen levels, which led to cardiac arrest. A toxicology report further showed that Anthony had administered a dangerously high dose of 2 muscle-relaxing drugs during the procedure, leaving Sarah unable to breathe on her own. After Sarah's death, the New York State Department of Health suspended Anthony Pignataro's medical license. Shortly thereafter, the Erie County District Attorney's Office in New York launched an investigation. Anthony, who had an inflated self-image, had opened his own plastic surgery clinic but failed to hire an anesthesiologist or adequately trained staff. Instead, his wife, Deborah, assisted him despite having only 6 months of medical training. Additionally, a young female medical student interned at the clinic. During Sarah's procedure, both Deborah and the intern reported that Sarah woke up mid-surgery, screaming. In response, Anthony administered additional drugs, causing Sarah to lose consciousness once again. Deborah noticed that Sarah's oxygen levels had dropped to a dangerously low level and alerted Anthony, but he ignored her and continued the operation. Shortly after, Sarah's lips turned blue. She stopped breathing, and her heart eventually stopped. Investigators interviewed Anthony's colleagues and patients, uncovering a reputation for gross incompetence and recklessness. Many of his patients had suffered complications following surgeries. For instance, 78 years old, Sophie Butring underwent a tummy tuck performed by Anthony. She became ill after the procedure, but was hesitant to seek medical attention. Her son eventually convinced her to go to the hospital, which saved her life. She spent 6 weeks in the hospital, recovering from complications caused by the surgery. The New York State Board of Health eventually filed 30 charges of professional misconduct against Anthony. Investigators discovered that he was not licensed to perform plastic surgery and that his basement clinic was grossly unfit for medical procedures. In January 1998, Anthony, then 38 years old, was arrested. By August of that year, his medical license was permanently revoked. Anthony ultimately accepted a plea deal on a negligent homicide charge and was sentenced to 6 months in prison, fined $5,000, and ordered to complete 250 hours of community service. He was also permanently banned from practicing medicine. As the verdict was announced, the judge ordered Anthony to be taken into custody immediately. Deborah, who was visibly upset in the courtroom, was not allowed to say goodbye to her husband. However, if Deborah had known what lay ahead, she likely would not have shed any tears. In December 1998, Anthony was released from jail. He returned home to live with his wife and children, but struggled to find work. During this time, his mother provided financial support. Despite the challenges, he resumed an extramarital affair, which his wife, Deborah, eventually discovered. Furious, she kicked him out of the house. 2 months later, he returned, begging for a second chance, and she reluctantly took him back. By May 1999, Deborah, then 42 years old, suddenly fell gravely ill. She suffered episodes of nausea and body pain, which gradually worsened to include tingling in her arms and legs, difficulty walking, and extended periods confined to bed. Although Deborah sought medical help, doctors were initially unable to determine the cause of her symptoms. Over the following months, her condition continued to deteriorate. By the summer of 1999, she required a wheelchair and began experiencing memory loss. Anthony claimed her symptoms were caused by a diseased gallbladder, which he insisted needed urgent removal. However, Deborah's physician warned that surgery would be too dangerous and could result in her death. Eventually, toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of arsenic in Deborah's blood. A criminal investigation into Deborah's poisoning was launched. Tests conducted on her hair showed that she had been exposed to approximately 30 grams of arsenic in varying doses since May. During questioning, Deborah recalled that her symptoms began after eating soup Anthony had prepared for her. Investigators suspected Anthony had been poisoning her over time. Deborah granted police permission to search their home, where they discovered ant killer containing arsenic. Further evidence revealed that Anthony had purchased the poison using his credit card. He was subsequently brought in for questioning. Anthony admitted to poisoning Deborah, but suggested that the relatives of his deceased patient, Sarah, who passed away after surgery, might have been involved. Due to insufficient evidence, Anthony was released. Deborah was discharged from the hospital, though she remained in a wheelchair and needed ongoing treatment at home. Later, a former cellmate of Anthony's, who had shared a prison cell with him, contacted the police. The cellmate revealed that Anthony had discussed his wife, Deborah's life insurance policy, and his relationship with his mistress. According to the cellmate, Anthony confessed he wanted to start a new life with his mistress and obtain the insurance payout. He had even asked the cellmate for advice on poisoning someone. Recorded phone conversations confirmed that Anthony maintained contact with the cellmate after his release from prison. With this evidence, Anthony was arrested on May 9, 2000 for attempted murder. While he initially denied poisoning Deborah, he eventually pleaded guilty at the end of 2000. Prosecutors proved that Anthony had been adding small doses of poison to Deborah's food and planning to send her for gallbladder surgery, hoping she would die during the procedure. His motive was to prove he wasn't the only doctor to lose a patient on the operating table, reclaim his reputation, and regain financial success. He also sought to justify Sarah's death. Anthony Pignataro was sentenced to 12 years in prison. While incarcerated, he continued to file lawsuits, claiming that Deborah intentionally consumed arsenic to end her life. However, Deborah refuted this in interviews, stating she would never harm herself and even suggested Anthony should experience arsenic poisoning. Following the trial, she divorced Anthony and obtained a protective order prohibiting him from contacting her or their children. Deborah endured a lengthy recovery process after the poisoning. She revealed in interviews that she suffered lasting health issues, including reduced limb mobility and sensitivity, and required outside assistance for daily life. In December 2013, Anthony was released from prison and moved back to New York, where he worked as a grocery delivery man. He legally changed his name to Tony Hote in 2014 explaining that he wanted a fresh start. By 2016, he launched a cosmetic company and falsely portrayed himself as a practicing doctor on the business website. He marketed a product called the Plasma Protocol, claiming it was the first anti-aging skincare treatment derived from a person's DNA plasma. The company operated near his previous plastic surgery clinic. Neighbors began reporting suspicious activities at Anthony's residence, including deliveries of surgical supplies and frequent visits from women in the evenings. These reports prompted police attention, leading Anthony to shut down his business and move to Palm Beach, Florida, where his brother lived. New York police warned law enforcement in Palm Beach about Anthony, describing him as one of the most dangerous people they had ever encountered. By 2019, Anthony was advertising elder care services online and continued to move freely across the country. Florida authorities monitored him, but there remained concerns about whether he posed a risk to others. As for Deborah, she maintained a private life and struggled with the lasting impact of Anthony's actions, unable to fully recover her health or independence. Samantha Vernagallo and Drew Garnier first crossed paths as young adults on Long Island, New York, where they both grew up. While the specifics of their first meeting remain private, it's clear that their connection blossomed during their early 20s. Samantha, who lives in Center Reach, is a former student of Center Reach High School. She is well liked for her warm, caring personality and her dream of raising a happy family. Drew, from nearby Lake Grove, shared her aspirations for a traditional family life. Over time, their bond deepened as they discovered they both envisioned the same future: marriage, children, and building a meaningful life together. Samantha appreciates Drew's stability and commitment to creating a safe living environment. Those who know them see them as a loving couple, working toward a common goal of a happy future. Thanks to the support from their family, both Samantha and Drew grew up mature and did not face any serious issues. Neither had a troubling past, no criminal records, substance abuse, or significant mental health concerns. Drew held steady employment and showed dedication to supporting his growing family, while Samantha was known for her beauty, compassion, and devotion to her loved ones. After several years together, they married and had 2 daughters, Adelina, followed by Izzy. 3 years later, Samantha embraced motherhood wholeheartedly, always putting her daughters first and ensuring they felt safe and loved. As the family grew, they began to feel the financial pressures of living on Long Island, dreaming of a quieter, more affordable life where their daughters could thrive. Samantha and Drew decided to leave Long Island and relocate to Masonville, a small town in Delaware County, New York, situated in the scenic Catskills region, about 150 miles northwest of New York City. Masonville offered the simpler lifestyle they desired: lower living costs, a close-knit community, and a peaceful environment where children could safely play and grow. The family settled into a mobile home on Hook Road, a quiet area where neighbors knew one another and a sense of community prevailed. For Samantha and Drew, the move symbolized a fresh start. Samantha envisioned an idyllic childhood for her daughters, filled with natural beauty, fresh air, and the security of a supportive community. She remained fully committed to her family, caring deeply for her 9-year-old daughter Adelina and 6-year-old Izzy. Drew quickly adapted to the new lifestyle as well, finding work and showing dedication to his family. From the outside, Drew and Samantha Garnier appeared to have a strong marriage and a happy family life. Their life in Masonville seemed stable and focused on building a better future for their 2 daughters. Their joy grew even more when Samantha found out she was pregnant with their 3rd child. By September 2024, she was 5 months along and had learned they were expecting another daughter. For Samantha, this news brought immense happiness. She cherished being a mother and was excited about welcoming another little girl. However, those close to the family noticed that Drew's reaction to the news was quite different. While Samantha celebrated the idea of another daughter, Drew had been hoping for a son. Family members later revealed that Drew's desire for a boy had intensified with each pregnancy. Hearing they would have a third daughter deeply disappointed him and seemed to affect him in ways that no one could have foreseen. Despite this hidden tension, there were no visible signs that Drew was capable of violence. He had no criminal record, history of domestic abuse, or encounters with law enforcement. To their neighbors, their family was an ordinary family, adapting to life in a small town. Samantha, although noticing subtle changes in Drew's behavior, remained focused on her family and the upcoming birth of their third daughter in February 2025. She also looked forward to celebrating her 30th birthday, just 2 weeks away. Life in their family household carried on as usual during late summer and early fall of 2024. Adelina and Izzy, the daughters, went to school each day. Samantha managed the house while preparing for the new baby, and Drew went to work. Anyone observing the family would have seen a picture of normalcy, but underneath, Drew's disappointment about the baby's gender was quietly festering. With no outward signs of trouble, no calls to the police or family interventions, no one could have predicted the tragedy that was about to unfold. Those who later tried to understand Drew's actions were baffled. On the surface, he seemed to have everything: a loving wife, 2 healthy daughters, steady employment, and another child on the way. Samantha had built a life filled with love and stability for their family, but for reasons no one could fathom, the good things in Drew's life became a source of anger. On the night of Wednesday, September 4th, 2024, just days after Labor Day, their household appeared to be winding down from a normal day. Adelina and Izzy were likely getting ready for bed, and Samantha, 5 months pregnant, was caring for her daughters and preparing for the evening. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but beneath the surface, Drew's frustrations had reached their breaking point. At around 11:29 p.m., the quiet town of Masonville was jolted by an emergency that shocked the entire community. Drew called 911 to report what he described as a domestic dispute at their family home. To the dispatcher, Drew sounded like a man trying to help his wife. He claimed Samantha had been injured and that he was applying pressure to her wounds to stop the bleeding. However, when police arrived at the scene, they discovered a horrifying scene that was completely opposite to what Drew described, permanently shattering the image of a peaceful family. New York State Police troopers Corey King and Ronald King were dispatched to respond to an emergency call. When the troopers arrived at the mobile home with its covered porch, they were prepared to assist what they believed was an injured woman. Instead, they were confronted with an unthinkable scene. As they approached, Drew briefly stuck his head out the front door before quickly retreating inside. His suspicious behavior immediately alerted the troopers that something was wrong. Shortly after, a single gunshot echoed from inside the house, sending shockwaves through the officers. They quickly retreated to the end of the driveway and called for backup from a Delaware County Sheriff's deputy, using the deputy's patrol car as cover. The officers cautiously approached the house again. Suddenly, Adelina, a 9-year-old girl, emerged from the home, running toward the police with her clothes soaked in blood. The officers' hearts sank as they realized this child had witnessed unimaginable violence. Through tears, Adelina told the officers that her mother had been stabbed and that her father, Drew, was still inside the house with a gun. As they worked to protect Adelina, her 6-year-old sibling, Izzy, also ran out, similarly covered in blood. Both sisters were deeply affected by the horrific events that had just occurred. Despite being injured and in shock, they still tried to talk to the police. The officers provided first aid to the children and called for additional medical assistance. It was clear that both girls had endured a horrific ordeal. Once they were safely transported to receive medical care, the focus turned back to Drew inside the house. The officers called out for him to surrender, and to their surprise, he walked out of the home with his hands raised. Drew was immediately arrested without resistance. The officers noted he was covered in blood and had cuts on his hands. During his arrest, police found a butter knife in his pocket, a chilling piece of evidence that would later shed light on the brutal events of that night. Inside the house, the officers found Samantha lying on her side, critically injured with multiple stab wounds. Despite their efforts to provide life-saving aid, it was clear her injuries were severe. Emergency medical personnel arrived, and Samantha was airlifted to Wilson Medical Center in Johnson City. Both daughters, Izzy and Adelina, were flown to Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse as well, due to the severity of their injuries. Investigators later determined that all three victims had been subjected to a prolonged and brutal attack. Tragically, Samantha succumbed to her injuries and was pronounced dead at the hospital. She was only 29 years old and just 2 weeks away from her 30th birthday. Her unborn daughter, whom she had been 5 months pregnant with, also did not survive. Adelina and Izzy remained hospitalized in serious condition but were expected to recover physically. However, the emotional trauma they endured would require extensive therapy and support for years. Drew was transported to A.O. Fox Hospital for treatment of superficial self-inflicted wounds. After receiving care, he was processed at the New York State Police Barracks in Sydney. He was charged and faced full legal accountability for the horrific attack. The investigation that followed was detailed and exhaustive, led by New York State Police, with support from the Delaware County Sheriff's Office and local law enforcement agencies. Major Lucas Shooter, commander of Troop C, held a press conference on September 6, 2024, to provide new information regarding the arrest and charges in the case. What made this case particularly unsettling for investigators was that it marked the first time the state police had been called to Samantha and Drew's residence for a domestic issue. There were no prior reports, no history of domestic violence, and no indication that Drew was capable of such violence toward his own family. As the investigation progressed, police discovered additional alarming evidence. A search of the property revealed that Drew owned multiple firearms and 2 high-capacity ammunition-feeding devices. These findings led to weapons-related charges being added to the list of crimes he faced. On September 5, 2024, Drew Garnier was officially charged with second-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted second-degree murder. He was arraigned at Delhi Town Court and sent to the Delaware County Jail without bail. Recognizing the gravity of the case, Delaware County District Attorney Shah Smith quickly convened an emergency grand jury session. On September 11, 2024, the grand jury issued an 8-count indictment against Drew. In addition to the original charges, the indictment included weapons violations, second-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, criminal use of a firearm, and multiple counts of illegal weapon possession. Drew pleaded not guilty to all charges at his arraignment before Delaware County Court. Judge John L. Hubbard, who ordered him to remain in the custody of the Delaware County Sheriff's Office without bail. If convicted on all charges, Drew faced a potential sentence of 25 years to life in prison. However, as the case advanced, it became evident that going to trial would force his daughters, Adelina and Izzy, to relive the trauma of that horrific night by testifying. To prevent further emotional harm to the girls, prosecutors opted for a negotiated plea deal. On March 25, 2025, Drew pleaded guilty to reduced charges of first-degree manslaughter and 2 counts of first-degree assault in exchange for a total sentence of 30 years in state prison, followed by 15 years of post-release supervision. District Attorney Smith explained that, although the sentence was lower than the maximum possible sentence, the agreement was in the best interests of Izzy and Adelina. The sentencing hearing took place on May 13, 2025, in Delaware County Court. The courtroom was filled with family members, community members, and court officials. During the hearing, only one victim impact statement was read, that of Samantha's father, Gregory Vernagallo. He provided critical insight into what had driven the crime. Gregory informed the court that Drew had wanted a boy and became furious when he found out Samantha was pregnant with their 3rd daughter. He explained that this shocking revelation, that gender disappointment had motivated such horrific violence, had added a deeply disturbing dimension to an already tragic case. He also shared that he had adopted his 2 granddaughters and devoted his life to raising them, stating that he was their father now and would protect them. He added that he hadn't left their sides since the attack. When given the chance to speak, Drew addressed the court with apparent remorse and expressed his regret to his in-laws, especially his children. He also expressed hope that someday he could make amends with his kids. He said he would not force anything on them and respected their decisions, but added that if they ever wanted to see him, he hoped he would be allowed to be there for them. Public defender Joseph Hermeti emphasized the lack of logic behind the crime, stating that his client, Drew, had no explanation for what had happened. Joseph described the situation as extremely tragic and mentioned that he didn't believe anyone would disagree with that assessment. Judge John L. Hubbard considered Drew's clean record before sentencing him. The judge said Drew had taken the life of his wife and harmed his children, who were entitled to his protection, and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. During the hearing, Drew asked for permission to continue contact with his daughters, Izzy and Adelina, while incarcerated. Delaware County District Attorney Shah Smith strongly opposed the request, urging the court to impose the longest possible no-contact orders. Judge John agreed and issued stay-away orders for both Izzy and Adelina until 2056, which is 8 years beyond Drew's maximum potential release date. The judge added that if the daughters ever wished to contact their father, they could petition the court to revise the protective orders. Drew refused to sign the court orders, but they were served to him in court regardless. His refusal was seen as further resistance to accepting responsibility for his actions against his children. This heartbreaking case has had devastating consequences for all involved. Samantha and Drew's 2 daughters, Adelina and Izzy, are now orphans because of their father's actions. The girls are now legally adopted by their grandfather Gregory and have moved to a new home to settle down and receive better care. A GoFundMe campaign organized by Aaron Leahy from Center raised over $16,000 to support Izzy and Adelina. The campaign described Samantha, the girl's mother, as compassionate and loving. It revealed that Samantha was pregnant with a baby girl due in February 2025 and was just weeks away from celebrating her 30th birthday when her life was tragically cut short. The crime shocked the residents of Masonville, a small, peaceful community where such acts of violence are extremely rare. District Attorney Sean Smith commended law enforcement for their diligent investigation and dedication. He mentioned that what made the case especially chilling was the lack of any warning signs that could have foreshadowed such violence. Drew Garnier had no prior criminal record, mental health issues, or prior interactions with law enforcement. The revelation that gender disappointment over an unborn child could escalate to the murder of a pregnant wife and an attack on his daughters serves as a sobering reminder of how domestic violence can erupt without any prior indications.